Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another Survivor retrospective of a season 20 years after its initial release, this time talking about Survivor Guatemala, which is such a bizarre season of Survivor to be doing a video of here. Probably one of the most forgotten seasons of Survivor, where it's kind of in this spot where it's not like old enough to be like one of these remembered classic seasons, but also not modern enough or really having much of an impact after its initial season to really be looked at too fondly either. Where it's just a season that is in a weird space in Survivor's history, yet despite that, I think it's a solid season. It's a season that I've always stood up for. I'll be honest, after my latest rewatches, my opinion of the season probably went down a little bit, though I still do like the season probably more than the general consensus, though it is a season that, again, feels pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of Survivor outside of a couple footnotes that we'll talk about along the way. But despite that, it's still a pretty humorous season with some great characters and some, again, first for Survivor history, though outside of that, it could be looked at as a pretty mundane affair. But either way, again, I'll be running through the season like I do of all my other retrospectives, running through the season from beginning to end, starting it off with the premiere. A very unique premiere here in the sense that it very much doesn't feel like Survivor, where I feel like most people that watch Survivor, especially in the modern day, watch it again for the social strategy aspects of the game, seeing the connections between these people and how they utilize them in the game, and really none of that is in the premiere here, where so much of it is revolved around this opening challenge. And in the grand scheme of things, this premiere does very little to set up the season as a whole, which makes it a very unique episode, but not entirely bad one. Again, I do actually think there is some appeal here to just how different this premiere is to any other season, though, again, probably isn't the optimal way to be starting off a Survivor season here. But and we do start off with Jeff standing in the middle of some Mayan ruins, talking about the Maya Empire, which gets talked about a lot on the season. Obviously, something that a lot of people miss in Survivor, these like cultural references, where even in the title of the season, there is the subtitle of the Maya Empire. And this is definitely a season that does still try to connect itself to the cultural roots of its location. But again, we get a lot of hype over how there's going to be extreme temperatures, with this really being a pretty brutal season conditions wise. I actually feel like this is a season that kind of gets forgotten about just how brutal the season is, where and they spend the entire season in ridiculous heats in spots where they can't even go into the water because of them being filled with crocodiles, and there also being so many bugs, and there being howler monkeys that keep them awake. This really just feels like a pretty miserable location to be playing Survivor in. But again, I do find it weird how we set this season up with them saying that there's going to be 18 strangers, which is like, not exactly. Again, we see only 16 hiking up to Jeff's location, already separating the two tribes, where right away you do notice that it is very white, where that is definitely a thing to call out here. Survivor Guatemala is just how very undiverse this cast is, only including one POC, that being Lydia, to where it's kind of insane that there was literally a point where the cast was 17 white people, one POC, where even in old school reality shows, you would at least see a couple POC, especially amongst a cast this big, again, a cast that is 18 people, to where, again, the fact that Guatemala settled for just one is pretty insane. And it also leads to a lot of this cast just feeling very samey. There's a lot of people on this cast that I just feel like are the exact same archetype, to where I find it very bizarre the way this season is cast, where again there's a lot of people from the south, a lot of like rancher types, where it does make me question, like, was this cast put together with like the returnees in mind, where they specifically cast people that they knew the returnees would be able to work with? Because really, from a archetype perspective, I do find a lot of the casting choices on this season just very questionable. But anyway, we see that initial group of 16 arrive in front of Jeff. They're told that they'll be using the tools that the Mayans use, which again, cool aspect of the culture being built into camp life. The fact that on this season they are given corn to eat instead of rice. They're given Mayan tools to use around camp. But here we also get the reveal that each tribe will also have one other tool, which is a very funny way of describing your returning players, as we get the reveal here that out of the top of the pyramid comes Bobby, John, and Stephanie from Survivor Palau, with them instantly shaking hands, which is funny considering their clearly fractured dynamic as the season goes on, with Stephanie here being set up as the strongest woman to ever play this game, someone who will not quit. I guess, again, she literally like quit an immunity challenge for food, but either way. And then we have Bobby John as a strong competitor and the hardest working survivor ever, which, sure. Well, obviously, again, this is all set up to the first ever captain season of Survivor, and really of any of these social strategy reality shows. The first time they bring in only a handful of returning players, where before this, again, we've had returning players on these sort of shows, but in an all-star format. We had Survivor All-Stars, Actually, even at this point, Big Brother hadn't even had his all-star season. So again, the concept of bringing in returning players, but not on an all-star season, was a very unique concept. And this time with them being utilized to captain the two tribes, which is obviously something we later see be utilized a lot more, like 10 seasons down the road, where there was that stretch of seasons where we got a lot of captain seasons in a row of Redemption Island, South Pacific, Philippines. Though here, when it's utilized in Guatemala, it felt, again, very fresh. And a lot of the reason why, and it seemed like something that the producers just actively wanted to do. It didn't seem like it was kind of based around this notion that we need star power on this season. It seemed to be just based on the concept they literally just wanted to test out how it would work out if there were only 2 returning players on a cast. As this is something that had been in the room mill before the season filmed, where I know already rumblings that returning players were getting calls. And while, again, you would think that Bobby, John, and Stephanie would be these ideal picks at this point in Survivor history and, again, would be brought back because of their popularity in the previous season, it doesn't seem like that was really the case. It really does feel like this was a position where the idea to have 2 returning players came first, and then they started to brainstorm ideas. Well, I know it's been said that the initial concept for the season was going to be Wanda and Jonathan, obviously the 2 players that were kind of screwed over in Palau by not being picked, that they were going to get their second chance here, which again would have been interesting. I also know that Scoopin and Roger from Australian Outback have also claimed to be in the process for this as well. I know Hunter Ellis claimed he was called for the season, but again, that's Hunter Ellis for you. But again, it does feel like a spot here where this wasn't a season like built for Bobby, John, and Stephanie, in the sense that it wasn't initially concepted as this is our way to get Stephanie back on TV, more so the fact that they wanted 2 returning players, and they ultimately settled on Bobby, John, and Stephanie in a spot where, again, it feels like a no-brainer that you would pick them. Where this is the point where obviously Stephanie was so popular, essentially next coming of Rupert, reaching the levels of popularity Rupert had, also just being an inspiration for younger women, to where it just felt like a spot here where Stephanie was kind of a no-brainer to bring back. And again, if you're going to pair her up with somebody, it makes sense to pair her up with Bobby, John. Again, having the 2 oolongs that made it to the end of their tribe, that never won a challenge. Again, there is this like redemption story for them, to where, again, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to be the picks here, though also kind of surreal that Bobby John is a 2-time player, considering I feel like he's probably one of the more forgettable 2-time players in Survivor history, even though I do think he's actually probably an understated character. But it does feel like a spot where he was brought back here, again, largely off the back of Stephanie's popularity. But again, I do find this intro to them being very funny. The fact that, again, they're on the top of this temple that they proceed to have to climb down very slowly. But obviously we see Bobby, John, and Stephanie being separated into the 2 tribes, with Stephanie being on Yasha, a teal blue tribe, all Bobby John's on the Coom, which is a pale yellow, which is kind of a unique color, I guess, for Survivor. But ultimately these starting tribes really don't matter much, which is a weird thing about this season. The fact that a lot of the beginning portions of the season come off very irrelevant, as really most of the relations made in the early portions of the season ultimately don't end up mattering. It really is the swap tribes that end up sticking into the merge, to where it is kind of a weird aspect of this season, the fact that so much what happens early on is just kind of irrelevant to the back portions of the season, which leads to, again, it being very difficult to really set up future storylines, which does lead to this being a pretty slow start. But again, we see the players' reactions to Steph and Bobby John being here, with Brian being excited, saying we're winning because we have Steph. Which, I mean, like, clearly you haven't watched Survivor Palau. Obviously, Brianna crying, saying that Steph is such inspiration, and Lydia later telling her that she's the reason she's here. Where, again, Stephanie was so popular to the point where, and it is funny to see all these women, but really fangirling over Stephanie in a spot where she doesn't keep that popularity as the season goes on. But again, it really does show just how revered Stephanie was at the time. But this is also contrasted by Jamie being upset, how she's here, as how will he win when she's here, when it's like, actually, it makes it easier for you to win. As really an understated aspect of this season is how much there was an anti-returnee sentiment all out there. Talk about not wanting them to win because they already had their second chance. And to be fair, again, Stephanie kind of blows her win equity by the end anyway, to where even without the anti-returnee sentiment, I don't think Stephanie would have been a likely winner. But still positioned here where I do think it would have been a very difficult task for Stephanie and Bobby John to go on to win a jury vote, which was certainly not helped by the fact that they were sequestered separately from the other players, where obviously the 16 newbies were all together on the pre-jury trip, and probably were assuming that they just were the cast, considering most other previous seasons were 16 people. Yeah, for Bobby John and Stephanie to just be added on at the very end, meaning 2 more people to compete against, 2 people that have already had their chance at Survivor, and also 2 people that are probably going to take up a decent amount of the screen time, considering they're returning players. I think there clearly was some frustration at the fact that Bobby John and Stephanie were on this season, to where it definitely disadvantaged them from the very beginning in terms of likelihood to win the season. But on the Nakum side of things, we do end up seeing Danny being happy to have Bobby John over Stephanie because men are stronger than women. And also, he's easy on the eyes, I guess. Again, all this kind of a lame opening confessional from Danny, who ends up obviously being the winner of the season. Obviously, a spot where there's a lot of precedent for the first confessional being very integral to a winning player's storyline. Yet this is a season where that really isn't the case for Danny. And obviously, there's been a lot of talk about how Danny was not really giving the producers much while on the island, that she intentionally not tell them her strategy because she was worried that they would leak it to other players, to where, again, you can maybe say that's the reason why Danny's content early on is so insignificant, though, again, there clearly could have been a better confessional than this to start off Danny's storyline, where really, again, this just ends up being a nothing confessional for her winning edit. And Danny's always been a strange figure in Survivor history in that despite how under-edited she is and how you would expect Jeff to not like the type of player Danny is, Jeff has talked pretty favorably about Danny in the years since, particularly before Winners at War. And to be fair, I know she was called for like some other returning seasons, and maybe it was through those casting processes that his opinions changed a bit, though, again, I know he was seemingly pretty disappointed with her at the time, where I know that coming into the season, they were very much expecting her to be this like big flirt. I think essentially what they later look at Parvati as, to where when on the island itself, she ended up being very different, to where that's one of the major reasons why Jeff doesn't like this cast in particular, is because there were supposedly a good chunk of people that they really liked in casting that were just completely different when they were on the island, which again is a typical thing Jeff says about people he doesn't like on a season, where the reality is, I think, just in general, the casting of the season was very wonky to begin with. But we do follow this up with a pretty great confessional from Brandon, who I think is a pretty understated character on this season, one that has some really great one-liners across his run. He's talking about how Bobby John is a hard worker, but he's a little bit dumb, which is a great pointed confessional from the very beginning. But we do have Jeff confirming here that Steph and Bobby John are actual players in the game, and that you can use their experience, or they could be easy first vote-offs, which I feel like, why say that? Because clearly they wouldn't want them to be the first vote out. But I do think this is an interesting thing to point out here, in the fact that, again, this had to be confirmed to the cast and to the audience because this was actually not known at the time. Again, nowadays, if we see these two returning players on a cast, you just assume, oh, they're playing. Yet, again, at this time, it was not a guarantee. It was a spot where, despite the fact that there was known to be returning players called for this season, it wasn't known that they were actually going to be playing the game. And even beyond that, it wasn't actually even known that Steph and Bobby John were the two returning players on this season until literally weeks before the season even started. And even then, they didn't market this the lead up to the season, which is also interesting because again, you would think they would really milk the return of Stephanie for all it's worth, yet they really didn't. Left it as a surprise for the audience here, as even coming into the premiere, it was not known to the audience if Steph and Bobby John were actually going to be playing the game, which again is fairly unique in comparison to how future seasons would be marketed. But either way, we finally get to the first challenge of the season, that being a challenge that takes up most of this premiere, being a reward challenge that is a grueling 11-mile race through the jungle, which is, again, pretty brutal, lasting over a day, and again, in the conditions of Guatemala, again, this extreme heat, while also having to carry your supplies with you as well, where there is this aspect of this challenge that, again, they did in Survivor Palau's immunity challenge, of this dilemma of how many supplies do you take with you, and all of this just for the reward of the better of the two camps, which ultimately doesn't matter, considering they're going to swap not that long after this, where, I mean, this is a very brutal opening to this season. Like, clearly the most brutal opening to any season, considering how many people are knocked out of commission from this one challenge. And again, all for you to be able to sleep in a Mayan ruin, which is, again, cool conceptually, though also probably didn't matter that much. Where, again, from a survival standpoint, it really felt like the two camps were not that different from each other. There's probably like a bit more shade in the ruins, but ultimately, again, it didn't seem to make that much of a difference. But again, with so much of this premiere just revolving around this trek, it really just, again, makes this episode feel not very Survivor-y. To where while we do get some player intros along the way, there's no real focus on any of the dynamics between the players themselves, no setup relationships. And again, it's probably because a lot of these relationships don't matter anyway. Though I do think it makes it a bit tougher to connect this cast from the offset because of that. But anyway, the challenge ends up starting where we see Jeff telling the tribes to go in two separate directions, which is very weird considering they're going to the same location. Obviously, it's because their supplies are in these two separate locations, but also, like, weird that they showed that, in my opinion, when, again, we know their destination's the same. But either way, we do see Steph instantly telling her tribe that we have to hurry, where I think clearly she was having some flashbacks to Jolanda and Palau, that obviously costing them to win that first immunity challenge there. But we do see her talking about her main fears, being an outsider and being looked at as too threatening. But instead, her tribe welcomed her, where really from the offset, Steph seems to be in a pretty good position on her tribe. Despite there, again, being this resentment against the returning players, it never felt like it actually put Steph in danger early on. And I do think that was definitely benefited from the fact that Stephanie was clearly the strongest woman on her tribe. And I know there's a lot of rumors around how the tribes were stacked up, that they put a lot of the weaker women on Stephanie's tribe to make her look more essential to that tribe, which, again, very possible. Though I do find the tribe divisions as a whole just very strange, where it does feel like Yasha, Stephanie's tribe here, ends up being significantly weaker than the other tribe, which is a lot of the younger men on it, even some stronger women, where Stephanie's tribe, again, has some of the weaker women. Also, like, just, again, like, archetype-wise, I find it very strange that, again, you get so many, like, of these rancher types on Bobby John's tribe, which, again, could be utilized to benefit him and, again, having people to bond with. Yeah, again, on Stephanie's tribe, we have, like, Rafe and Brian on the same tribe, in a spot where, again, I feel like they're very similar archetype-wise. These, like, two, like, nerdy, college-age super fans. But either way, again, as expected, Stephanie's tribe ends up struggling from the offset here. Stephanie being very indignant here, being upset at Lydia and Amy for not being fit and for lagging behind, which, again, might not be the only time Stephanie complains about her tribe. But we do see Nakum taking an early lead and really just keeping in the lead the rest of the time, though, again, the size of that lead does change over time. But, again, they are clearly the strongest tribe here. A lot of the young bucks, where, again, just kind of insane to see the likes of Bobby John, Brandon, Blake, all on the same tribe. Oh, again, you have like Brooke and Cindy, who are also like kind of similar as well, where, again, just a lot of the same sort of archetypes. But then we do see that tribe being led by Jim, the oldest person on the cast, but also seemingly the only person that knows how to work a compass. And him getting some personal content here, talking about his experience in the Marines. I know he was a firefighter who, again, despite him being older than Tom Westman, I know talked about like being worried that he'd be targeted because of him being like Tom Westman, when it's like, yeah, I feel like there's a certain other person in this cast that kind of had that reputation instead. But it did seem like Jim was someone that had a lot of potential, again, being a pretty well-revered person on his tribe, definitely being respected for how well he led the tribe through the track, even though the edit portrays it very differently, obviously, to explain him being the first boot, but it shows him like guiding the tribe as if he's like being a bit domineering and he's showing them in the wrong direction, when the reality is, again, he's really the reason why they win this challenge. Always see Yaksha trailing from behind with Gary leading that tribe, and again, Gary being the one that clearly has more Tom Westman parallels there. Not necessarily in terms of occupation, but more so just in terms of the role he plays on his tribe. But we get talk about how clear it was that he was going to be the leader, with him being tall and having gray hair, with Rafe then proceeding to say that the leader always gets voted out first. Where, again, Rafe is a big super fan of the show. Yeah, probably one of the biggest super fans at this specific point in the show's history. Though, again, they don't really show that on the show. It's not really talked about. Yeah, it's obviously moments like this where you can tell he's like referring back to Survivor history. But this is where we start to get personal content for Gary, with him being asked what he does, with him saying he's in the landscaping business. To which we cut the confessional to him laughing, revealing he was in the NFL for 11 years. And his real name is Gary Hogaboom, but no one needs to know that, as that would lead to him being voted off, I guess. Saying if someone recognizes him, he say, "That isn't me, I'm Gary Hawkins," which is all like a very funny subplot on this season. This notion that Gary Hogaboom, this football player that, from what I understand, wasn't even like a big name by any means, was not even like cast on this season as someone that they wanted because he was a former NFL player. I think they literally just wanted him as this like older leader sort of figure. Yeah, he really just makes such a big deal out of the fact that he was in the NFL and how he would be targeted if they knew that, when, again, no one seemingly cared. And it's really like his lying about it actually probably causes him more issues than not. And obviously he does later get recognized, but it's really a spot here where most people probably would not know who Gary Hogaboom is. And even if they did, it probably wouldn't have affected his game that much outside, again, maybe harming his win equity because they would assume he's rich. But ultimately, again, this is just kind of a ridiculous subplot on this season that, again, is humorous, but again, largely based around like just how faulty the strategy around it seems to be. But then we cut back to Nakum, where you start to see them having some issues here, particularly from a tree branch breaking and landing on Blake's shoulder, which ended up having thorns on it, which seemed to be a pretty major injury there, along with the fact that we later see him puking in the middle of the night, with him being dehydrated, with Margaret being the one to tend to his wounds, with her really funnily just like narrating this entire sequence, and her being the one to talk more about his injury than he himself, where Margaret was a pretty focal character throughout the premiere here, being a narrator for their tribe, particularly around how she attempting to nurse them all back to health, which does make her come off as one of the more likable people across this premiere. I know she was a pretty big Edgic frontrunner from the very beginning here, but again, this challenge does take place overnight, to where we do see them struggling to sleep in the middle of the jungle, with howler monkeys keeping them up, with Amy saying our minds are a predator. But the next morning, we do see Brian really leading the Yaksha tribe telling them they need to go, with him really just narrating the sequence here, again, explaining why he's the one with the most Yaksha pride. But they do surprisingly end up catching up to Nakum, with them being right in front of them, which is kind of insane that, again, in a trek that took place overnight and went on for hours, the fact that the two tribes were this close to each other, where we also get a very outdated reference from Cindy saying it's like Seabiscuit. But ultimately, Nakum ends up being the first to reach the boats, to where they have to do a final row to their camp, with the other tribe arriving as they start rowing, with the Nakum ends up keeping that lead, only for them to have some troubles when they get there, with Judd instantly jumping out and getting stuck in the mud, which is a very funny visual, along the fact that we also get an incredible confessional here from Brandon, saying that Judd had a premature evacuation. But it's also here where we get a lot of focus around Bobby John really struggling, where he previously had been struggling from dehydration, and here we see his body cramping up as he tries to get out of the boat, and literally yelling at his legs to come on, which is, again, a pretty rough start here for Bobby John's second appearance. But ultimately, Nakum still ends up winning the challenge here, where I do find it very funny that Jeff is literally giving them their spiel and like giving them their flint and their flag. Almost the tribe feels barely conscious, just laying down under a tree. But we later see Yaksha also arriving here, which, where again, it is funny just how harsh Jeff is on them. Where again, after an overnight hike, we literally have Jeff saying to them, "You're not staying," and that a close finish gets you nothing, and you have more paddling to do, where really the two camps just seem to be on the other sides of this lake. So we do see Yaksha getting to their camp, which really just felt like a random plot of land. It didn't feel very suited for a camp, but I guess that's why it's the worst camp of the two. So we did randomly just have a dock, which is funny. But really, most of their content here is pretty insignificant, and just showing them working on the shelter. All Stephanie's excited to have a tribe with as much heart and determination as her. With, again, Steph really just buying in her own supply on this season. On the Coombe, we see the men still struggling here. Again, Margaret narrating over all this, us seeing Blake still puking, saying that the girls held up well, but they expect the guys to go down so early, which, again, to be fair to the men, I believe the story here is the fact that they were carrying, obviously, a lot of the supplies, and obviously that became a harder toll for them. So again, we see most of the men here being knocked out. We see Judd and Blake both puking. We see Bobby John down to the point where his eyes roll back, and then just saying his name while he's unconscious, which is, again, a pretty scary moment here. Again, probably feeling like the most scary, like, medical incident on the show since Scoop and Falling in the Fire, at least. So it is funny that even by the end of this episode, Cindy's talking about how the trek wasn't worth it to get the better camp here. Of the men that were sick, we do see Judd being the first to recover here, gloating about how much he's adapting to the jungle and loving the jungle life, calling himself Jungle Judd, which is a nickname that doesn't stick. But ultimately, again, we do get his intro here about being a fish out of water, that he is a doorman in New York that's never gone camping, with Judd obviously being one of the major characters of the season, probably the best character on this season, with him just being a really great source of conflict across the season. Though also this entire sequence here ends up being very funny, knowing the context behind it, the fact that, again, Judd is the first one up of the men here in a spot where supposedly he was the reason why a lot of them got sick to begin with, where, again, Judd does seem to be on the outs of his tribe from the very beginning, and supposedly it stemmed from him mixing up the tribe's water supply during the trek, which led to them mixing the drinking water with cleaning water, which the men drinking the cleaning water is what led to them getting sick here, which, again, does add some context to this season. Again, really just showing why Nakum looked obviously way more sick than Yaksha through the trek, along with the fact that obviously Judd seemed to be pretty isolated from his tribe and very against his tribe from the very beginning. But anyway, we do see the players getting their first tree mail, with Steph being excited they have another chance at immunity. Or again, one of the two, Stephanie or Bobby John, have to win immunity here. So again, it'll be a first immunity win for one of them. So you get the immunity challenge, it being a pretty brutal one here. Other than having to paddle out, grab a torch, and then drag their boat up the shore using logs to roll it. Again, utilizing a Mayan transporting method, which, again, cool callback to cultural aspects. But you find it funny how there literally is just one person that is meant to just carry the torch and light the fire at the end, kind of continuing this trend that you notice in like Survivor Vanuatu, there's being a role for like one player to do, where they essentially do nothing for most of the challenge. But the challenge ends up being very close here, where we do see a lot of people getting hurt by logs rolling over their feet. But ultimately, Yaksha ends up pulling out the win here, to where, again, despite Nakum clearly being the more physical tribe, they were obviously still pretty weak from the trek itself, which we end up seeing Bobby John hitting himself in the face as they lose, which is a funny little callback to him beating himself up in Palau. But ultimately, this ends up being the first immunity win for Stephanie. Again, leading into tribal, we don't really get that much focus on strategy here. We do get some content from Brooke, of all people, who's probably one of the more forgettable people on this season. Yeah, she is talk about how she doesn't want any of the women to go, which, again, you would think it's to keep the numbers for the women, but no, it's because they've shown to have endurance I guess. Oh, we see Bobby John still being sick and being set up as a potential target here. Oh, we have Brandon talking about Blake being crippled and how he doesn't think he'll make it, to where that sets up Blake as a potential target. Oh, well, Jim also gets set up here, having torn his bicep during the challenge. For Jim also being, again, in his 60s, I think it made a pretty clear decision of who should be voted out here. So we don't really get that much strategizing here, with Margaret saying it's tough to strategize when a third of your team is out. Or again, they were still clearly trying to recover from the trek. We do get the tribal, where it is a pretty cool set here, being in the middle of a Mayan acropolis. And we do get an interesting first tribal here, where while the beginning of it just starts around a lot of the talk about how this is the toughest beginning Survivor's ever had and how all the men were sick, it does lead to a fun moment here between Jeff and Judd, with Jeff mentioning that Judd was on his back and asks if he thinks he's in trouble, only for Judd to give a very aggressive response to all this, saying he was only on his back for an hour at most. I puked, I got up and did what I had to do. I don't know what to tell you. I'm ready to do a backflip. And Jeff saying that it was just a simple question, and this is a very fun response here from Judd, and in a position where I know Judd and Jeff certainly did not get along. I know at the time Judd was probably one of Jeff's least favorite players to be on Survivor. Again, probably not from an entertainment standpoint. I think it would probably be in the spot where he recognizes how entertaining Judd is, in a spot where he just was frustrated to deal with Judd, in a spot where Judd was just very openly upset at how prodding Jeff's questions were, and seemed to want to push back against any of Jeff's narratives he was spinning, to where I know it led to them looking at Judd as pretty hard to deal with here. But ultimately, again, we get to the vote itself, where Jim is unsurprisingly voted out in an 8-1 vote, in a spot where Jim votes for Margaret, which very much comes out of left field. And it's very funny considering, again, throughout this entire episode, we've gotten a lot of this focus around how Margaret is nursing all the men to health. Yet again, she's the person that Jim decides to vote out here. And again, not even Bobby John or Blake, who were set up as potential targets, where all that's very strange. But ultimately, again, we lose Jim, and again, there's not really that much to say about him. Again, it seemed like he was pretty well liked by his tribe. Again, he led them through the first challenge, so we're in a spot where he did not get injured. It does feel like Jim actually probably had a decent amount of potential on this season. Yeah, ultimately, again, I don't know how game savvy he necessarily was. I would not really look at him as a likely winner, but someone that definitely had a lot of longevity. And again, I don't think it would have been the first boot had he not gotten injured. So again, there certainly was a level of potential there for Jim, but ultimately, again, we're not going to ever see it. But over episode 2, a pretty ho-hum affair, though, again, a couple notable moments throughout it. But we do first start off in the Coombe, getting lost on the way back to camp, which is kind of funny. But we see Bobby John being upset at how he's still going to tribals and he's ready for it to change. So I wonder if that'll end up changing. Oh, we also see him getting tree mail for a reward challenge. Though, again, we see the tribe still being sick, with, again, Bobby John still coughing, and Blake saying he can't breathe and heaving on the ground in pain, with Brandon saying he can't handle it out here and he has to man up, where I find it very weird how we get a lot of setup to this, to Brandon being the main one to complain about Blake, only for Brandon to be the only person to vote to keep Blake when Blake ends up going home, where I find it weird how this is all set up, which ends up being a weird dynamic there. But anyway, we get a reward challenge where it ends up being a pretty notable one to me, even though really for most people it's probably largely forgotten about one. But it's one where they have to go one by one and grab bags along this giant spider web, and they have to crawl under it, to where, again, a really interesting challenge visually here. And one that is pretty back and forth, where we do see each player having to go one by one, though everyone has to go at least once, to where we do see Nakum taking an early lead, with Rafe and them losing a lot of time here for Shaw, in a spot where he's really struggling to just climb the ladder, which again, I guess is foreshadowing Brandon Donlin. Then really funny how Rafe is looked at as physical liability early on in the season, only for him to obviously become the best challenge competitor of the season. But we do see Judd end up dropping here as well, all while Jamie makes time for Shaw, linked to it being tied coming into the final bag, with it being pretty close between Blake and Brian. Though again, Blake finally mans up and barely pulls out the win, being this big hero moment for him. If only I cared about Blake. But it leads to this, again, very weird edit for Blake, where he talks about how he's starting to feel better. Already see him and Brandon using the fishing gear they won to go fishing and catching the smallest fish possible, only for the later cut to Blake struggling once again and laying down, with Judd talking about how he doesn't do anything and just rests all day, and how much relaxing does this dude need, man, and being upset that Blake's just saving his strength for challenges, as Judd wants to be the hero in the next challenge, where, again, clear setup to the immediate challenge, but also, again, very clearly showing where this is really all coming from for Judd, where it's really this ego thing. But anyway, on Yaksha, we do see Stephanie, again, talking about how this is a fun camp, and this is much different than last time. How she gets along with her tribe, and they have good morale. All the other teams not having fun, and it's all because of Bobby John, because he's so damn serious. Because clearly Bobby John was the main issue with Oolong. It certainly couldn't be Stephanie. But it is also really weird how we get Jamie proceeding to get a confessional running through the tribe, talking about how they have the most diverse group here, pointing himself out as a bum, only to then say we have a police officer, a fishmonger, a magician's assistant, a landscaper, and a gay guy. Which, it's like, one of those is not like the other. But again, also really funny to literally get a confessional about Jamie talking about diversity and what is the least diverse cast in Survivor history. It is here where we start to get some content revolving around Rafe and talking about how he's desperate for food. And he'll try anything out here, which, again, we get multiple segments of this with Rafe across the season, which is very strange. But, again, he ends up finding a grasshopper and asking anyone if they want to eat it. And then we see him and Gary, like, finding an ant mound, to which they start eating the ants inside of it, with Steph just being in the background saying it's so nasty. But, again, playing more into the survival aspects of the season, more so than the actual relationships, where, again, it could have shown the majority alliance and shown, again, the connection between, like, Steph and Rafe, them with Gary and Amy. But, no, we don't. We just get them eating ants. But then we get some focus around Gary here, really setting up the upcoming vote on this episode, saying that everyone's working hard except for Morgan. That you have to work hard around camp to get people on your side. Oh, and then cut to Lydia creating a fish trap using sand and a burlap sack, to which she's actually able to catch like 10 tiny minnows. He's showing Lydia as his provider and really highlighting this dichotomy between Lydia and Morgan. But it's here where we also get reintroduced to Gary's storyline about how he said he's in landscaping and he's not a quarterback. That no one asked him what he did 15 years ago because, again, people clearly care about what you did 15 years ago. It's all to remind us of this coming into the immunity challenge, as we do get tree mail here, which does imply a tug-of-war challenge. But it's here where we get content from Danny, talking about how she works in sports radio and knows that Gary on the other team is a pro NFL player, which I also find funny that she sees to shade him, saying that he's a quarterback and they're usually not as athletic as the other football players. But also, again, very random considering how the fuck does she know who Gary Hogaboom is? Which obviously she later tells the story during the reunion about how she was visiting his alma mater as part of her job and saw a shrine to him. But really outside that, again, like, no one would know who Gary Hogaboom is. Just kind of insane that the one person that would actually recognize him ends up being on this season here. But it leads into the immunity challenge. Again, a tug of war that has tribe members being connected to each other and have to retrieve the flag on the other side. A very weird challenge in the fact that initially it is between the entire tribe, only for there to be a rule that after 15 minutes, if there's no winner, then they go to one-on-ones, which I question, like, why didn't we just do one-on-ones to begin with? But again, obviously it ties. But during the one-on-ones, we do end up getting Judd versus Gary, with Danny saying to him that he's a quarterback and you're a linebacker. I was exposing that he's a quarterback to his tribe, with his tribe leader asking him about it, and he continues to deny, saying that she's just trying to disturb our tribe, because clearly to do that, she would just make up a lie about him being a quarterback. And again, it says that if they knew that he was a quarterback, he'd be voted out immediately. Where, again, it's very funny how clearly everyone knows that he's a quarterback. Like, people clearly recognize that, yeah, this is the truth. Just no one cares. Yeah, he obviously just continues to make such a big deal about this that it just becomes funny. But again, following up on that previous content, we do see Judd here winning the challenge for Nakum. In a spot where, in his matchup with Gary, we do see Gary just being kind of an idiot and deciding to tackle Judd towards the end. In a spot where, like, that's just handling the win to Judd, because you're giving him the advantage there. But also here we do proceed to see Jamie losing his matchups, with Jamie just kind of sucking at these sort of challenges, which kind of becomes a trend for him. But in the lead up to the vote, we do see Jamie being someone that actually does want to vote out Stephanie here, saying that she knows how to play the game, only for Gary to shut this down, saying they need tribe strength. And word of this getting back to Steph, with her being shocked that her name's out there. And it's just the inexperience from Jamie, as clearly that's the only reason why Jamie would want her out. Proceeds to say that it's R-worded, which won't be the last time Stephanie says something questionable. And again, all really funny considering it's coming from a woman that literally led the charge against Jolanda at the first vote of Survivor Loud, where you should not be the one complaining about how someone else wants to take out a physically strong woman as the first vote. Either way, Gary sets up the vote here as, again, between Lydia or Morgan, with the dilemma being that Morgan is better at challenges but doesn't work around camp, while Lydia sucks at challenges but does work around camp. And ultimately, I think the vote really just comes down to the fact that people just loved Lydia, where Lydia ends up being very under-edited on this season and is someone that clearly production did not like, despite the fact that she seemed to be adored by her cast. And, Rafe has said that he thought Lydia was going to be like the star of the season with how much of a character she rose around camp, to where to see her barely be on the show despite that is, again, very strange. But the show really tries to make it seem like Lydia was going home, only for Brian to be told about this and say that she's more valuable than Morgan, to where we see him warning Lydia, telling telling her to campaign. With the edit, again, trying to make Brian out to be this, like, mastermind here, where from how the show later portrays it, it doesn't feel like he did that much of the legwork to actually save Lydia. And it was more so her own campaigning to Gary that saves her, but I guess some of that really stemmed from how last second this was, where supposedly Lydia was going home until very late in the day, and Brian lied to Gary about how Morgan was coming after him, which made him switch, which again, didn't really make the show. Which makes us feel like it's just such a forced storyline, where again, the reality is that Gary was seemingly the one really running the tribe, where the true core of this tribe ended up being Gary, Amy, Steph, and Rafe, which the edit doesn't really show, and there was an initial alliance on this tribe that was actually created by Morgan, of all people, where it essentially was that core group, plus Morgan and Brianna, leaving out Jamie, Brian, and Lydia, where really Brian was kind of an outsider on this tribe, but again, clearly that group did not stick, though again the core of this tribe did seem to be branched off of that group, but ultimately again it doesn't get any focus in the edit here, probably because it has no factor into the actual season itself. Sure, again we get the tribal, which is pretty boring, just a lot of talk about how unified of a tribe they are, and we do end up seeing Morgan being lined up for a blindside here with her really just not knowing it's coming, and again Brian getting credit here, saying he hopes his last minute scrambling worked out, and we get an 8-1 Morgan vote with Morgan actually getting no confessionals on her way out here. And she did get some in the premiere, but literally nothing in her boot episode, which is very strange for Survivor US. And I do love how we instantly see Jeff's disdain for Lydia being confused over the vote, essentially being like, how could you not vote out Lydia? She should obviously go home. But either way, again, we lose Morgan, and realistically, Morgan's probably one of the most forgettable Survivor players. I think really the main thing that keeps her somewhat memorable is the fact that she's a magician's assistant, and I feel like that bizarre occupation gets mentioned at points, but really outside that, Morgan is just so forgettable. Again, doesn't really play a factor into the season, despite the fact that, again, she seemed to be someone that actually maybe had some potential. Again, as I said, she created the initial alliance. I believe she was actually a fan of the show. So had she been on a like more modern season, I actually think there's a world where Morgan could be a competent player, yet on a season like this, that, again, very much valued work ethic. Again, Morgan just did not blend in here to where ultimately, again, just did not have an impact on this season. Anyway, we get episode 3, another kind of slower episode, but one that still had some moments in it. Though we do start off with Brian taking credit for the Lydia move, saying it was 100% him, surely. Though also in the same breath saying that he wouldn't fuss over Lydia being the next to go, which I question, like, why? Like, why'd you care enough to save her the first time if you're just going to let her go the second time? But either way, it's at this point that we realize Brianna's on the show, where we see her being very awkward around Lydia, saying that they don't get along, that they're cordial, but she's just not her cup of tea, which clearly was setting up their dynamic as being important on this episode, and also, again, should have been a kind of a giveaway that Brianna's probably heading home, considering who is Brianna up to this point. But again, we get talk about Brianna wanting to be looked at as an asset, to where we see her making some corn mush, which leads into a transition to more of talk about how terrible the living conditions are, with us literally getting another segment of Rafe and Gary going out trying to look for food, and Rafe finding a mound of termites and eating them, and Steph being in the background again talking about how nasty it is. Again, just very weird that we literally got the same sort of scene in 2 episodes in a row, in a spot where, again, we still don't have any focus on their actual relationships here. But to this point where we do also get some focus around Amy, who does get more fish out of the water content, talking about how she has no outdoors experience. She never thought she'd be living like this, but she's never gonna give up. I wonder if she'll be in a situation where most people would give up. Either way, we do get to the reward challenge, a very weird one where it is the blindfold challenge, but they end up mixing that in with them also having to recreate a archaeologist tent for some reason, where we literally see them get all the items for the tent and then afterwards take off their blindfolds to put together a tent, which, why? Anyway, Yaksha ends up having the lead throughout the blindfold portion, only for Nakum to make up that time and have a pretty big comeback during the building portion and winning it there, to where on Nakum we do get some pretty humorous Judd content for him being annoyed how he can't sleep due to the howler monkeys and they're driving him out of his damn mind, only for Cindy to say it's a monkey that's lost and can't find its group. Judd proceeding to call her Dr. Doolittle and seemingly being annoyed at Cindy for being sympathetic towards animals, to which we then get a montage of him breaking branches. But I'll say Cindy is someone that is a weird figure on this season, the fact that she is pretty under-edited for a decent chunk of it, and really for early portions of the season, I feel like the only thing we truly know about Cindy is the fact that she just loves animals. Though, again, she comes off fairly likable here, again, talking about how much she loves the experience and people would pay for this, where, again, she just seemed to genuinely just love the experience of playing Survivor and being out in the wilderness. I know she talks about that postseason, that she could have lived out there, which, that's miserable, but at least someone enjoyed it. But it's also here where we do get some content revolving around Brandon, where Brandon is someone that I think throughout the early portions of the season, I very much would have looked looked at as an Edgic frontrunner. He is someone that just, I'd say, a lot of like unimportant content throughout the season, a lot of narrational content that made him feel like someone that was important. And to be fair, again, he ends up being the merge boot, and the merge boot typically does get a bigger edit than normal. But again, I definitely felt like Brandon is someone that we were meant to be caring about throughout the early portions of the season. Here he gets to talk about how hot it is outside and how the water is so tempting, but they can't go in because the Gators, only for him and Bobby John to do it anyway. Saying they have to live on the edge and that the brave might not live long, but the cautious don't live at all. Which, I mean, to be fair, probably not a great line there for him to go on to win the game. But again, still, this content here did not feel particularly necessary. But we do get some drama in this episode as well from the tribe starting to work on their shelter, trying to put a tarp on, only for Margaret to be annoyed at the guys, where they're just talking about doing things, and it's taking a while. So we do end up seeing her starting to give instructions, Bobby John being annoyed at her supervising and saying that this was supposed to be fun, and that you can't tell grown men what to do all the time. Which, I mean, obviously, again, not great on Margaret here to come off as a bit domineering, but also, again, feel like Bobby John being a bit indignant here. Starting this Judd-Margaret feud here, with Judd also saying that he's here to have fun, and she's trying to enforce all the rules and bark orders, and that's not fun, man. So again, I do love how, like, angry Bobby John and Judd come off in this scene, only for Margaret to just come off very demure and confessional, saying that she doesn't understand what they're doing, and says, am I impressed? No answer. Which, again, clearly, like, a sarcastic confessional, but definitely not one with as much vitriol as what we get from the other two. But either way, we see the tribes getting their tree mail, which they're given body paint, with Danny getting personal content here, talking about how she always paints herself for Chief football games because sports is her entire character at this point. But it also leads into Brian leading a cheer on Yaksha, almost as if he has the most Yaksha pride. Oh, I have Lydia talking about wanting to be a star out there as she's on the chopping block, which is funny setup that just how important this immunity challenge is. Oh, you obviously get set up from Lydia talking about needing to be a star out there because she's on the chopping block, because surely Lydia will do very well at the challenge. Oh, we also get pretty funny setup to how important this immunity challenge is to keep the numbers in the game, because surely the numbers in the pre-swap will definitely matter, which I'm fair, they actually do matter, but not in the way that people think they do. Either way, we get to the immunity challenge, where it's a basketball style challenge here of them having to play on a net, tossing a ball through a hoop, though an additional rule here is the fact that they can't move while holding the ball to where you have to pass it, where they say it's based on a Mayan game that, from what I understand, is nothing like the game that we're seeing here. So I do find it funny that Jeff literally says during this challenge that you're doing it like the Maya did, when it's like, clearly you're not. But I did find it also very funny that we get a moment of Lydia running with the ball, only for Jeff to yell, no! Where again, it felt like another moment of Jeff just showing his disdain for her. But a pretty big moment here ends up happening from Amy injuring her ankle along the way, with her hobbling around immediately afterwards, which obviously this injury ends up really plaguing the rest of her run. All this ends up being a challenge that Nakum has the very clear physical advantage here, with Danny being the star of the women matchups here, only for Steph to get frustrated Brianna, who's just standing there in the background and not doing anything. And Steph's upset that she doesn't know what a pick is, which, I'll be honest, I don't know what a pick is either. But again, the edit very much just blames Brianna for this challenge loss, to where, again, clearly Nakum pulls out the win here. For Anya Shah, we do, again, go back to Amy, talking about not wanting to give up. So we do have Gary and Rafe reassuring her that she's not going home despite her injury, to where really, like, again, the target never ends up shifting onto her, which is, again, good for Amy. Oh, we get some pretty indignant content from Steph, her saying, here we go again, and you can't do this again. She's trying not to cry, ranting about her tribe, saying that he can't even run. Brianna's a makeup artist that has her head up her butt. And then we have a fishmonger who isn't athletic, saying that why can't I just be on a great tribe? Because surely you are not part of why the reason the tribe is bad. But again, Lisa, Gary, and Steph complaining about Lydia and Brianna in the challenge, being upset that they never played sports in their entire life. For clearly one, the two were going home, though we end up seeing some content here from Jamie saying that Brianna's done for and this is her last day on Survivor. Says he didn't like Brianna from day one. He likes them crazy and pretty and she's neither, which is, again, a bit harsh. Again, I had a crush on Brianna when I first watched the season. Also, again, him saying that he likes girls crazy, again, checks out. If you do not know, Jamie did end up dating Nora from Survivor IOI before she was on Survivor, so again, kind of checks out. But again, we get content right here around Brianna being scared that she's the weak link and says that she's voting for Lydia. She doesn't like her anyway, where, oh, Gary said that this is a vote about who's athletic. But really outside that, like, this vote isn't properly explained. We don't really see any of the actual strategizing to vote out Brianna. It just happens here. where again, the tribal itself ends up being so revolved around the challenge and challenge strength that really doesn't matter. I did find it funny that, again, Jeff ends up calling out Lydia here for not doing any better than Brianna, where again, it felt like Jeff was kind of guiding them to try to vote out Lydia. But anyway, we get to the vote where Brianna ends up voting for Lydia. While Jamie votes for Brianna, saying that you're a girly girl and go back to the shopping mall and leave the jungle. Which again, a little bit harsh. Anyway, it's a 7-1 Brianna vote. Pretty expected. And with that game, we lose Brianna, who is another one of the more forgettable Survivor players in the history of the show. Now, again, I remember Brianna because, again, I had a crush on Brianna when I first watched the show. That's at least something I remember. But really outside that, again, she is pretty unnotable on this season. She really is pretty quiet in the edit for the first couple episodes, and then she ends up popping in her final episode here, but again, it's all negative, really just in a way to explain why she goes home, to where it really felt like no care was actually put into her portrayal on this season, to where ultimately, again, just kind of a forgettable figure in the show's history. And now we're episode 4, essentially the point where the season actually really starts, where, again, this ends up being the swap episode, aka the episode where the relationships that actually matter for the end of the game end up being finally set up here. But we do start off with some content on the original tribes, with Nakum again talking about the conditions and how it's 114 degrees, and we get a montage of all the bug bites, with again, Brandon getting some decent narrational content here. Though again, another spot where, in retrospect, kind of contradicted in him saying that their tribe's on top, but they can't imagine how the other tribe feels, only to cut the Yaksha catching fish, with Rafe being able to trap them in a pot, and kind of shows them thriving to a degree. And at the same time, we also get some content around them seeing a crocodile, and it's coming their way, only for it to eat a fish in the distance. That's something, but again, it's really an entire showcase of just the conditions on the season. But it leads into the reward challenge, kind of, which looks like an auction with the tribe sitting at benches, with Jeff saying that he's going to give them a bit of relief, give them a chance to learn what the others think about you. We see them being given questions where they answer with one of their fellow tribe mates, where each answer will have an effect on the tribe mate chosen. Now, some more than others, which I do think can be a bit unfair, just how disparate some of these results end up being. But either way, we see Jamie and Danny being voted in as the one in most need of nourishment, to where they end up getting an apple. Oh, we have a vote for the smelliest, which ends up being Bobby, John, and Gary, where they get a shower. But then we get to the questions that actually matter a bit more, where we get the vote on which man and woman from each tribe is the most deserving of a picnic afternoon, where they will be returning to their camp later this afternoon, which is very important wording there. To where on Yaksha, we end up seeing Gary and Amy be picked. Oh, well, for Nakum, we see Margaret and Judd, to where, again, they end up going off. All the now remaining players end up being asked who has the most tribe pride, who bleeds Yaksha blue, and who bleeds Nakum yellow. With Cindy being picked for Nakum, while Brian ends up getting very narrowly picked over Stephanie for Yaksha, which again would have led to a very different result on the season if it went Stephanie's way. But in reality, again, this is essentially just screwing them both over, where we get the reveal that this was all just a convoluted way of doing a tribe swap, which I actually do like conceptually, this idea of having tribe swaps that involve a little bit more strategy to determine who goes on which tribe. Though something I don't love about this, that again, it just feels very arbitrary in how this ends up happening, where it's really just based around just these last 2 questions, where it's specifically a spot where Brian and Cindy, again, being the ones that are decided as the players of the most tribe pride, end up being the ones to stay with their tribe alongside the 2 players that went on the picnic for whatever reason, while everyone else ends up swapping tribes, except for also the fact that there's like 1 extra Nakum member due to uneven numbers, which again makes you question why swap now with uneven numbers, again, so early on in the season, where there's a random draw for the person that gets left behind on Nakum, which all said and done, this essentially is just an auto screwing of the person with the most tribe pride from the Yaksha tribe, where they automatically go into a 4-3 minority, while the Nakum members at a 4-4 split, which again, why did they decide to go with that disparity? Where ultimately it's not like Brian was that well positioned on his original tribe to begin with to necessarily be like fundamentally screwed by this twist, but it's still a spot where it just feels weird that you're getting screwed over based on a vote of how much you love your tribe. Oh, well, also the random draw for the Nakum member that stays behind on Nakum is essentially also a random draw for an automatic majority, where the person that doesn't end up drawing the Nakum buff essentially ends up being put into a 4-3 majority on the Yaksha tribe, where we end up seeing Brooke being left behind Nakum, which again definitely will play a factor there. And really just in general, again, I do think the concept of this swap here is interesting. I do like when it's more than just a random draw, but at the same time, I do feel like this is a spot where the mechanics around all of it just feel a bit convoluted, plus also, again, a spot where it just kind of fundamentally screws over certain players, where I don't necessarily like that. Though I do like that they at least tried something different here. But either way, we do get to the picnic, where again, they're on top of a temple, where we do get a pretty fun moment here from Gary being asked about him being in the NFL, only for him to say he wasn't, with Amy saying, watch Gary be a multimillionaire, I'll kill him. Which might not be the last time she says something to this nature. But either way, on the new Yaksha, we see just Brian being there with a now new Nakum majority of Blake, Bobby John, Brandon, and Danny, with Brian obviously knowing how screwed he is. So we also get a pretty funny reaction in Gary's return to camp, with them equally knowing how screwed they are, with Amy saying, they're decimated out here. Decimated. Gone. Which, again, is a fun confessional from her. But again, this leads into Gary talking about his landscaping business once again, with Danny saying that, I thought you played for Central Michigan, with Gary proceeding to say that, yeah, I went to Central Michigan, but I didn't play, which is an insane thing to say, where it's like, why not just say, I didn't go at all? Maybe, again, for all I know, he did tell the rest of his tribe he went to Central Michigan already, but it's still, again, such a dumb thing at this point. Just tell them that you are in the NFL. It really doesn't matter. With, again, Danny clearly knowing that he's lying here and saying that maybe he just doesn't want people to know because he doesn't want people to think he has money, which, again, is literally what happened here. Oh, Gary says that he'll die with the lie till the end and that he's not going to blow his strategy. He's going to keep his cover because that cover is clearly still there. But this leads to some strategy talk between Blake and Bobby John, talking about how they are going to stick to their 4-person alliance, which they're saying this while peeing, which is, again, an insane shot here where we literally see them from behind talking game while on a bathroom break, which is like, why was this even being recorded? But again, they end up talking about how Amy is the first to go due to her injury, again, still having a swollen ankle. And again, we see her clearly trying to not show how much pain she's in, though really it's also being set up for just how much she needs to win the upcoming immunity challenge. Oh, we didn't get to see some content from the new Nakum, with Judd and Margaret returning to camp, where this ends up being a 4-4 split, where Steph, Rafe, Lydia, and Jamie end up being the ones to swap over, which is a really hodgepodge group there, where, again, Steph and Rafe were in the majority on that group, while Jamie and Lydia were kind of more on the outs. But obviously in this spot, kind of forced to work together, all while we see Brooke, Cindy, Judd, and Margaret be the OG Nakums, with Judd being a massive outlier here, having already been on the bottom of the original Nakum power structure, to where we do see Margaret instantly recognizing how she's not swapped into a particularly good position here, all while Judd loves the swap, and that he loves that Margaret's now walking on eggshells, and is happy to not be on a tribe with Blake, Bobby John, and Brandon, as now he's the big gun over here. He's King Kong. He starts batting on his chest, which is a fun confessional, but this all leads to Steph and Jamie talking about getting rid of Brooke as the weakest on the tribe, and also as a way to keep their numbers, where obviously if Lydia goes home, they would be in the minority, to where they talk about picking up Judd as a number, with Jamie really bonding with him right away, and Judd and Steph having a bond with him over being jerseyed, where, and we do see Judd instantly agreeing to go for Brooke, while Margaret sees Judd being chummy with me and Steph, but again, him not really hiding it, and him saying that he has no problem targeting his tribe, and didn't feel the love, and they have to go, and get out of his jungle. Or again, felt pretty clear where this vote was going to end up going, but either way, we do get to the immunity challenge, which has them having to paddle out to get bags of war clubs and break 3 targets, kind of a pretty typical modern Survivor challenge. But here we see Judd really struggling with the tossing section, with Jamie wanting to swap out, only for Judd to say no, which again, not a great look here for Judd after talking about how he's now the big gun on the tribe, but ultimately ends up coming down to the final tile between Brandon and Jamie, with Brandon clipping his, but it doesn't fully break, leading to a funny Bobby John celebration, only for Jeff to yell no. But ultimately, again, Brandon still ends up pulling out the win by the end. Again, typically what happens when it's Brandon versus Jamie. But in the lead up to the vote, we do get Rafe talking about how it's 4v4, and we just need one person to flip, where Rafe does come off fairly uninvolved during this round, where it really feels like he just allows Steph and Jamie to be the one to flip over Judd, where he's just kind of there, actually seeming to bond more with the women of the tribe. They're not really doing anything to keep them around. Oh, we see the Nakum girls agree to vote for Lydia, though Margaret says she doesn't know where Judd stands, where we do see Judd and Brooke talking, and he ends up agreeing to go for Lydia, which, again, you might say would be Judd lying, but again, Judd clearly never does that. Oh, well, he proceeds to tell Margaret that he thinks that the other tribe would be willing to do 1-1, insinuating that he would vote out Brooke in this spot with the intention of then voting out Lydia at the next vote, which was clearly never happening, and Margaret obviously fights back against this, talking about how this is a bad idea, though, again, it felt pretty obvious that Judd was going to be voting out Brooke here no matter what. To where, again, we do get a good chunk of content here based around Judd's dilemma, though, again, it didn't really even feel like much of a dilemma. And truth be told, I don't even think he necessarily makes the wrong move in this spot, where obviously, again, being the sole person to flip is not a great spot for your win equity. It definitely burns, obviously, people you flipped against. However, again, this is a spot where this is in the pre-merge. It's so early on in the game. Also, Judd does actually some pretty decent work building bonds with the people on the other side, to where he ultimately ends up being in a much better position here than what he would have been if he stayed with his original group, to where I actually do feel like for Judd, flipping in this position was actually probably the correct call. Anyway, we do get the tribal, where we do get a funny moment from Jeff calling out Steph as now having only won 4 out of 21 challenges she's been a part of. But again, the vote goes as expected here, with it being a 5-3 Brooke vote with Judd flipping. And I did appreciate the fact that they actually properly stacked the votes here this time to fake out a Lydia landslide, only for Brooke to end up being voted out instead, which again, I feel like rarely happens this early on in Survivor. But anyway, we lose Brooke, and Brooke, another one that is probably one of the most forgettable people in Survivor history. Really, the main thing I remember from Brooke is the fact that Rob's sister Nino talked about having a crush on her in the evolution of strategy. Where really outside that, again, Brooke is just someone that doesn't really play much of a factor in the season. Now, in comparison to Brianna, I actually feel like Brooke actually had a stronger premiere. To where, even though she didn't get that much content, I feel like the content she got in the premiere was actually pretty decent. But then, like, after that, she's just pretty invisible until her boot. And ultimately, again, Brooke is definitely another pretty forgettable figure, even though Brooke is someone that I believe is still around the alumni community and is still a fan of Survivor to this day, but just someone that, sadly, again, is from a pretty forgotten about season and just kind of gets fairly under-edited. And over episode 5, again, a pretty decent episode here, one that's largely remembered because of the Bait Blake moment, but definitely an episode that has some intrigue to it. But again, let's start off with fallout from Judd's flip, with him telling Margaret that this game's cutthroat and he was just playing the game, and almost as if he was lying, almost as if he admits to have lied at a point. But again, we get Margaret being upset at him, flipping right away, calling him a traitor, only for Judd to say that he doesn't give a flying rat's ass what people think of him. As long as his family loves him, that's all that matters to him. Again, this is just all clear setup to Margaret being the next to go here. Oh, on Yaksha, we do get some very clear foreshadowing here of Blake talking about how well the swap played out for him and that he has a good chance to win now, as they have the majority, which is very clearly famous last words. But this is where we do get some more fish out of the water content for Amy, with her getting attacked by a beetle and getting scared, only for Brandon to say Amy lived her whole life in the city and he's from Kansas and he's more used to farming type of people, with us cutting to Bobby John, where, again, kind of insane that Brandon and Bobby John were on the same tribe together. So we do see them talking about farming, only for Amy to have no idea what they're talking about, and then proceeding to awkwardly ask about how they make wheat, with Brandon and Bobby John actually talking this through, which again just felt very forced. But and this ends up leading to Amy talking about how she's the odd one out, despite the fact that actually, at this point, Amy actually seemed to integrate herself pretty well socially in this group. It did seem like a lot of them really liked Amy and planned to go deep with Amy. For somehow by the end of this round, she's able to get herself out of that position of being the number one target from her side, where, again, as of last episode, we saw a very clear talk about how Amy's the next to go, only for, again, that's a switch to Brian instead, which, again, I think is some good play from Amy. But this does lead to Brian also feeling a bit left out here, saying that he wouldn't be friends with them in real life and that he's very blue state and they aren't his style, with us proceeding to see Danny leading a prayer, with the tribe being very religious and him saying he's not religious, where again, Brian definitely does not really fit into this group here, and really doesn't fit into this cast as a whole, again, being this kind of very like new school style of player just on a very old school season here, to where I guess this is like kind of utilized on the show to really explain just why he ends up being the first Yaksha to go, even though it's not even content that's that different from what Amy was getting, even though I guess like Amy was probably trying a bit more to bond with this group. Either way, we do get to the reward challenge, with talk about how it's a bummer that they can't swim, only for reveal the reward is a floating swim cage that includes a deck and lounge chairs, which is pretty surreal for Survivor, for them to literally just be given a pool at their camp. But also, since being a pretty funny challenge, probably being the biggest blowout in Survivor history, where the challenge ends up comprising of a course where you have to cut through a rope with a stone, then chop a log, and use the handles you get from those to spin a turnstile, to lift up a cart, and then roll down a hill with the cart. Despite all this, the challenge ends up being decided from the very beginning, with Brandon almost instantly breaking through the rope, while Jamie is stuck at the rope for the entirety of the challenge, with Yaksha easily winning here, with Bobby John having this very over-the-top celebration as they ride down in the cart, like kicking his feet in the air, which starts some hostility between him and the other tribe, all while we do see Jamie proceeding to finally get the rope right after the challenge finishes, where, again, we get another funny moment from Jamie talking about how he still wants to complete the challenge, only saying, you guys just want to quit, only for Steph to be annoyed, saying that the challenge is over, where, again, this is a thing that Jamie does again later in the season, where, again, it's just kind of a funny thing, that Jamie just wants to complete the challenge, even though there's no point. But anyway, we see Yaksha get the pool, connected to their deck. Here we get content about how excited they are over it, and Brian saying that he's a fish back home and he loves the water, so again, good for him, I guess. But this all leads to more focus around Blake, with us cutting to him sleeping despite it being pouring rain outside and everyone else being huddled under an umbrella, with Amy proceeding to call Blake Golden Boy, which again ends up being pretty much the most notable thing about Blake, is his nickname Golden Boy, where she ends up saying that he'll come up smelling roses and will come up great in life. Though this all leads to more negative content for Blake, with Brandon talking about how full of himself he is and how he talks about himself all the time, and to which we lead to Blake telling stories about how he gets in trouble with older women and talks about his girlfriend and how she has double D breasts, because that's something definitely need to tell people, along the fact that also talking about how much bigger they got after she took the pill, which now it's too big and they're gross, and he's not a boob guy, which is like, why did this make air? This is an insane thing that actually made air. Forget, it's obviously bizarre the fact that he's even just openly saying this to his tribe mates. But obviously, again, this is a very awkward thing to be showing on their show, and I guess it further emphasizes the point of Blake just saying stuff that gets on people's nerves. But like, why this specific conversation? But anyway, it leads to Brian calling him an idiot, leading to Brian's biggest moment of the season, him saying that he plays a game called Beat Blake, to where he asks him questions to really just goad him into telling stories about himself, to dig himself into a hole. It says that he's going to give him the shovel, which, again, ends up being another spot here where I think Brian's obviously just like kind of hyping himself up probably a bit too much, probably thinks he played more of a factor into this than what he really did, though, obviously, again, still optimal play. I do think he plays this well, but, again, this is more so just a Blake messing it up for himself, more so than like Brian really being this mastermind that got Blake voted out. But anyway, with that, we then cut to Nakum, with Jamie apologizing for the challenge loss, where we do get some tension here from Cindy saying she knew the technique, only for Judd to be upset, saying that why didn't you step up to the damn plate? Again, kind of setting up a Cindy Judd feud that doesn't end up really happening. But this is all we get. Stephanie reacting to Bobby John's celebration, saying that he cheers like a girl and he's so gay. Gets so gay. Again, one of the most popular players in Survivor history. But also, again, it leads to just her being so indignant here once again, saying she's so sick of losing, and that she doesn't want to cry in front of her tribe. And this all feels like a bad dream, and that she doesn't want to relive Palau, and the same thing's happening again. She's like, I mean, technically you did win him, but it's not really the same thing. And talks about how, like, she's always in the less able group, and the group that sucks, where it's, again, like, you're part of that group. Maybe you're part of the issue. But this is contrasted by some pretty decent content from Lydia. Probably like the only like notable character moment from Lydia on this season. The fact that we see her talking about wanting to be a motivational person, to which she proceeds to do a cheer, singing "Here We Come to Save the Day," and does magic tricks and does the pancake dance, which is something that I guess is notable from her, all just randomly saying that she's the queen of rock and roll. Again, all this was very strange, but again, a notable Lydia moment. Even though actually we do end up seeing like Jamie being annoyed at her for this. But again, this is clearly like more of what Lydia actually was on the season. Like a spot where, again, it felt like the cast just really liked Lydia and that thought she was like a massive character that would be more in the show. Yet again, it's kind of just relegated just to this one scene instead. But anyway, we get to the immunity challenge with Jamie being annoyed at the other tribe, talking about their pool, saying that he's not smiling until they win. I wonder if that'll get followed up on. Though I would say Jamie, I do think plays this like all wrong. And to first Jamie, what do you expect? But again, he really just ends up making himself such an enemy to the other side, making him like the clear target for the opposition. But this ends up being the return of the like lacrosse style challenge that ends up being kind of a staple of like the middle era of Survivor, where they have to launch a ball with a slingshot and catch it with a net. Though this one's a little bit different in the sense that instead of each player having their own net, this ends up being a net that has 3 players having to carry one net amongst them. So this requires a lot more teamwork, but ultimately kind of a boring challenge where I didn't feel like anything particularly notable happens through this. But ultimately Nakum pulls out the win. Kind of surprising considering all the young bucks that are on Yaksha, where you would think they would have the advantage here. But this leads to Jamie giving a massive celebration here, yelling, "Who's smiling now?" Only for Bobby John to just scream back at him on the side, which I guess is starting their feud, with Bobby John saying that they're rivals because Jamie's from Georgia, because there's a Georgia-Alabama feud, so that's something. But either way, we see Yaksha having to go to Tribal, where we do see Brian obviously knowing that he's definitely disadvantaged here, being down 4-3. But we do see Brian and Gary realizing that Blake is on the bottom of the other side, and they think they can get Danny on board of taking him out, So we do see Gary proceed to do some legwork here with Bobby John, but again, doing it in a way that I don't love. Again, campaigning against Blake, because Blake is somebody that doesn't deserve to be at the end for whatever reason. But we do see Bobby John not get on board with this plan right away, saying that he doesn't want to go back on his word, though does say that Gary's smart and knows about team unity, almost as if he's used to being on a sports team. But again, we do see some progression here for Bobby John, at least, him saying that there are going to be times where he's going to have to switch his vote, which again, at least some recognition here from Bobby John that he can play a somewhat manipulative game, even though, again, it doesn't really amount to that much. Though, again, finally, he says that this is not one of those times, even though he does later change his vote anyway, which, again, is not explained in the episode at all. But the real important conversation seemed to come from Gary talking to Danny, with Danny agreeing that Blake doesn't deserve to go any further for whatever reason, with us just cutting to Blake now telling more stories, with Danny being annoyed at how much of a frat boy he is, with Danny proceeding to actually tell Brandon about her wanting to vote out Blake, only for Brandon to not get on board with this, which, again, is correct strategically. I think Brandon has the right idea here where, yeah, you definitely should not be getting rid of Blake, though the problem is that his alliance members do want to do that, and he doesn't really get on board with that, which, again, not great. Especially considering he doesn't really seem to be pushing his way. He simply just says, I'm not going to do that, but doesn't really try to convince Danny or Bobby John to switch their vote, to where really at the end of the day, Danny is in the power position in this group. And I think it's a bit understated where, obviously, again, the edit doesn't really focus that much on Danny during the early portions of the season, but it really does feel like Danny was the best position within this Yaksha group, having connections to really everybody, and also having like a final two with Brandon. That seemed pretty tight. But ultimately, again, I do think she ends up making the wrong move here in voting out Blake from multiple perspectives. Obviously taking out a number for her side to where we get to the next round in a 3v3, and obviously it works out for her anyway, but again, that's not ideal. Along with that, also, it's getting rid of a very strong challenge competitor, where again, it would not shock me if that could have played a difference coming into that final immunity challenge, that having someone like Blake would have been better than having someone like Amy. So again, I do think she ultimately makes the wrong call, but obviously, again, it kind of works out for her. But anyway, we get the tribal where we do get some fun content from Amy still calling Blake Golden Boy, with Jeff mocking him, saying that you were gasping for air, and now you're Golden Boy. But again, we do get to the votes, with us getting a pretty iconic Brian confessional here, voting out Blake, saying that you might be Golden Boy, but I'm Platinum. Oh, Blake votes for Brian, saying that you're the weakest of the original Yaksha, which is kind of like weaker than a Hoblimi. Well, really, Brian's decent in challenges. Like, I don't understand where this notion that Brian's weak came from, but either way, ends up being a 5-2 Blake vote, where again, Bobby John flips his vote unexplained, while Brandon sticks with Blake. You know, again, he knew where the vote was going, but just seemed resolute in that vote. So ultimately, Blake ends up going home here. And Blake's someone that, despite actually not getting that many confessionals, is actually a pretty prominent figure throughout the early portions of this season. Obviously, again, getting injured in that premiere, and then proceeding to have this kind of recovery, only from the, again, kind of have this big downfall edit at the end. Like, I do think Blake actually comes off as, again, a somewhat notable character from this season for an early boot, though ultimately, again, another person not particularly remembered that well in Survivor history, just, again, from a season that is kind of forgotten about. And really, I actually feel like Brian's bait Blake plan is something that is probably more notable than Blake himself. Though ultimately, I feel like Blake is someone that comes off as a particularly bad player. I mean, the fact that his own alliance votes him out for, like, no reason here, in a spot where it really makes no logistical sense to vote him out in the spot, I think is pretty bad, where, and probably something that's an understatedly bad player of Survivor, but someone that, again, largely just not really remembered much at all. But now for episode 6, which ends up being a very notable episode to me, particularly because of some incredible character moments that we get towards the back half of the episode, though it does start off with content around Brandon on Yaksha, with him saying the Blake vote really opened his eyes, that people would flip things around you. Which, again, I felt like this was all pretty good content for Brandon, us getting really his POV over the previous Blake vote. We see him asking Bobby John if he regrets it, only for Bobby John to say he did what he had to do, which, again, is not explained in any way. But this is all countered by Brian, saying that now it's time to get rid of the Nakums one by one, despite the fact that they're tight in numbers, where, again, I wonder how he plans on doing that. But then we got to Nakum, where again, we get more focus on the bug bites. How exciting. All this transitions to just talk about how miserable Margaret is, and how she brings negative energy to the tribe, with her having taken the swap hard, and Judd saying that she's miserable, that she's stuck with me, and can't grasp the fact that the old tribe isn't coming back. All Margaret says that she used to be high on the food chain and now is on the opposite end, where this was all just a very clear setup to Margaret being the one to go home here. To where ultimately this ends up being a very weirdly structured episode, because we get to the challenge where it's revealed that the immunity idol's not playing a part today because both tribes are going to tribal, which obviously is a twist that they've been doing over the last couple seasons due to the fact that they need a double elimination round. because of the bigger cast, and also it's a way for them to do like a one-day cycle as well. So again, pretty typical fare for middle school Survivor, though again, it feels kind of a bit weird how it misses with the original pacing of the original format. But here we also get the reveal that the winning tribe will also get the opportunity to play for individual immunity, along with the winner of that challenge also getting a sit-in in the other tribe's tribal, with, again, this kind of also being a standard at this point in the show, very much feeling like what they did with Survivor Vanuatu, where John Kenny won immunity and got to watch the tribe's tribal, and obviously in that spot got to also give away immunity, which, again, is a similar twist of how this is handled, though that part of it's not revealed here, which I do find it weird they didn't do that. And also weird how, again, this obviously ends up being a reward challenge where the winners end up getting burgers, hot dogs, and beer that they end up having to eat back at camp, which is something that, again, is weird for this sort of format where later on, and even before this, we saw them have to eat that reward at Tribal. And I feel like ultimately, if I were to guess, I think they probably realized that that's probably the better way to do it, where obviously because they end up being the reward back at camp, and this is, again, a one-day cycle that leads to most of the content from the winning tribe being about the reward, which ultimately, again, ends up being great content, and I think they kind of lucked out on that. But I do think it obviously leads to not as much strategizing happening because everyone's so preoccupied with eating food. But anyway, it ends up being a pretty interesting challenge here, a pretty physical one of them having to push a giant ball over to their goal, where the score 3 wins reward, where, again, we get a few notable moments through this. First in this being a challenge where Amy ends up re-injuring her foot, though despite that ends up still playing the round out and ends up winning a point, which is a great moment for her. Definitely this heroic moment that I'm sure would have been propped up as the reason why she's a hero on Heroes vs. Villains if she ended up making that cast, where, again, she was supposedly the alternate for it. But also we get a funny moment here from the men matchup where we do see Bobby John Brandon just decide to slam into the ball for no reason, where we end up seeing them have bruises following this, where it's again like, why'd you do that? Anyway, Judd and Jamie end up winning the challenge for Nakum, leading to a very awkward moment here of continuation of this Bobby John Jamie rivalry, with Jamie just, again, over the top celebrating, only for Bobby John to proceed to get in his face and yell at him, yelling, "That's what I like! That's what I like!" And we just see the others looking on in confusion, where, again, this is such a weird but funny interaction here that is probably like my favorite Bobby John character moment in his entire run on the show. But anyway, we get the individual immunity challenge now, where it's a pretty lame challenge of the just going back and forth across a field to get letters and then solve a word scramble. But everyone gets at a puzzle except for Judd, who ends up struggling to open his bags, only for him to look at Rafe's letters and say, "Ancient ruin, ancient ruin." With that obviously being the answer and leading to Rafe winning immunity, the first of many, though again, this one was kind of handed to him by Judd. But obviously this leads to Judd doing his typical thing of really just bragging about how, "I should have kept my mouth shut. I didn't know I was that smart." Because Judd needs to make you know that Judd is the best. But anyway, we end up seeing Nakum eating the reward, all while talking about how crazy Bobby John is, with Jamie saying that he was screaming back at him because us Southern people are just crazy. All Judd says that there's not a worry in the world, as he's one of the big guns out here. To where we proceed to get, again, another really humorous Judd sequence here, him asking for Rafe's beer, to which he ends up taking it, while also proceeding to make a deal with Stephanie, exchanging his hot dog for a beer as well, only for the tribe to eventually realize that there aren't enough beers left, clearly because Judd drank too many of them, and proceeds to pretend like he doesn't understand how this happened. Whoever drank the extra beer is going home tonight. Clearly wasn't you. And I do love how, like, Judd follows this up by saying, "How many do I have left?" as if he didn't already drink his share. And to be fair, I don't know if Judd legitimately just didn't recognize how many he drank, but clearly by the time he's in confessional, he doesn't care. He says he felt like he deserved it anyway, and that you wouldn't be eating this if it wasn't for me. You can kiss my ass and enjoy your hot dog and burgers. Again, clearly everyone knew it was Judd, and we even see Cindy saying that this will come back to get him, which it doesn't really. But again, like, them spending so much time on the reward here, eating burgers and hot dogs and drinking beers, really just leads to them having no real content to show of the actual lead up to Tribal, though again, it's a spot where it's kind of just a no-brainer. Obviously, Margaret is going home here, with her not really even trying too hard to stay, just seemingly staying this, like, anti-Judd presence. So I always find it kind of funny how she proceeds to call this situation a beer conundrum, which again is just kind of funny wording there, and just talks about how offensive Judd is, but again, clearly this isn't going anywhere. Oh, we then get content on Yaksha with Bobby John, talking about how cocky and arrogant Jamie is, and that he crossed the line with him for some reason. I don't know what he did. And that Bobby John says that he needs to let him know that there's another bear out in the woods. But either way, we then shift to the lead up to the vote, with Amy being concerned about her injury, with Brian saying that Amy's an easy vote, but that would lead to him being outnumbered, which is kind of funny considering actually Brian yourself for an easy vote, where again, they clearly just liked Amy more than Brian, though again, they do talk about it as like Brian's being voted out here because he's weak, even though, again, like he seemed to be doing okay in challenges. But either way, we see Brian talking to Gary about having to stick together to vote for Bobby John, with Gary clearly not being on board with this, where it's not really explained why. Though, again, it felt like a spot where Brian was never particularly close to Gary and Amy, who were more aligned on the original tribe, and it felt like they were just very willing to let Brian go, weren't willing to go to a tie, and also seemed to have pretty good bonds with the likes of Danny, Bobby John, and Brandon, to where, again, it never felt like Brian's plan here is going to go through, though the reality is Brian's plan here was actually to put together a plurality vote, which, again, literally a 3-2-1, which is interesting, as obviously at this point in Survivor history, this would have been a very innovative strategy, where this is one season before Cirie is able to do it in Survivor Panama, though even in the spot where Cirie did it, it felt like she kind of more stumbled into it, more so than like actively planned a 3-2-1, where Brian here was kind of more intentionally trying to cause a plurality vote, and attempting to get Danny, Brandon, and Bobby John to split their votes, only for him, Amy, and Gary to snipe out Bobby John, though ultimately, again, it never was going to happen. And again, it wasn't even shown on the show here, but again, definitely some strong strategy from Brian here, definitely his way out of this situation, even though, again, it just seemed like he was in a spot where he just did not have those connections with his fellow tribe members to get their trust to actually want to do this with him, but it is probably the optimal play for them in this position, where really by the end, it's pretty clear that Brian is the one that's going to go home. But again, we get to the tribals, which do take up a good chunk of the episode, mainly because the Nakum tribal here is probably one of the best tribals in Survivor history, especially from a character standpoint. Though I do find it weird how, again, Nakum is the one to go to tribal first, despite being the winning tribe, where, again, you would think that the tribe that won the reward challenge would be able to go later, because it's like weird that the person that gets voted out here is getting a lower placement because they won a challenge. Either way, this ends up being a tribal pretty much entirely revolving around Judd. Though it actually doesn't start that way, where it actually starts with talk about the Bobby John Jamie feud, linked to Jeff asking Margaret if the tribe has good sportsmanship, with Margaret proceeding to call out Jamie and Judd for not controlling their emotions on the ball field, leading to, again, one of the greatest sequences in Survivor history, definitely the most notable moment from this season for me personally, of Judd instantly getting annoyed and Jeff pointing this out, and Judd proceeding to go into this iconic rant saying, "It's not like we're being bad at sportsmanship. We just go out there and give it 120 damn %, man. Giving it my all, man." Where, again, I love these like rants that Judd goes on where he continuously just says man, and also, again, like him saying sportsmanships instead of sportsman is also very funny. But and we have Jeff responding to this saying, "Give it your damn all doesn't mean that you're a good sport or a bad sport," with Judd proceeding to continue the rant saying, "A win is a win, man. If we did good, man, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna go crazy, man. Like scoring a touchdown in a football game. That gives us more motivation to keep going, man. Drive it right to him, man. Keep driving it to him. I mean, that's not bad sportsmanship. We just keep driving and driving, man. We drive that ball all the way damn downfield until we score a touchdown, man." Which, again, like, just even reciting this, like, very difficult to say all these things. And the fact that Judd was able to, like, unpromptedly just rant about this is so funny to me. To which, at this point, we also get a funny moment from, like, Jamie rubbing his shoulders, like, trying to calm him down, which is, again, very funny coming from Jamie, where I actually really like this dynamic between Judd and Jamie. The fact that it seems like only one gets angry at a time, and the other one's kind of like trying to calm down the other whenever they get mad, which is, again, humorous to me. But anyway, Margaret ends up trying to talk at this moment, only for Judd to interrupt, saying, "You know what? You probably never played a damn sport in your life anyway, so you don't even know what it's like, man. So you should just, like, shut up." As Margaret responds by saying this happens all the time with Judd, and that he plows over anyone in front of him, and trash talks those that he doesn't like, and that's not good sportsmanship, with Jeff pointing out that Judd looks like he would strangle Margaret right now, and Judd piping up saying, "I'm just playing sports my whole life, man. I wouldn't consider myself a bad sportsmanship. This team that I have here, man, is awesome. I love it, man, except for Margaret. I love this damn team, man." Only to lead to probably my personal favorite aspect of this trial, where I think a lot of people will really call out the ADD moment that we'll talk about, but I actually think this is my personal favorite moment, where Margaret says that Judd doesn't listen to anybody. Judd only listens to Judd, leading to Judd interrupting her and saying, "Well, let's ask the other Judd listens to anybody. Cindy, do I listen to you?" Only for Cindy to say, "Yeah, and then Judd just instantly cuts her off, clearly not listening to her, and goes to Rafe, saying, "Rafe, do I listen to everybody?" And we see Rafe clearly being intimidated here, saying, "I honestly think," only for Jamie to then cut him off, saying, "Rafe, have an opinion." And Judd to say, "Just say yes or no." And with Rafe saying, "I'm just saying my opinion right now, you guys," only for Judd to just not listen to him and move on. Going to Stephanie and Lydia and Jamie, saying, "Do I listen to you, with them all saying yes in quick succession, and Judd to say, there you go. Again, probably, one of the funniest moments in Survivor history for me. Again, just like feeling like a moment out of a sitcom for him to literally be asking them, does he listen to them, only for him to just not even bother really listening to their responses, and really just looking for people to just to say yes to him. And again, it leads to Margaret saying that this is what Judd does. Judd bullies, only for Judd to say that you're full of it, man. And Steph to proceed to then compare herself to Judd. It's funny that even this is interrupted by Judd giving, again, probably the most iconic line of this entire sequence, saying that when I first walked into camp, Margaret was telling me that I have ADD. That's how you approach me? That's what you would like to say? She comes to camp saying you have ADD. Do you know that? When you first meet somebody, is that something nice to say? Is that a compliment? I have ADD. Or again, obviously this ADD rant is something that is probably the most notable aspect of this tribal for most people. And again, it is really funny because Judd is literally getting up and pointing to like emphasize the point during all this, only for Margaret to have a great response here saying the other problem with Judd is that he has a problem with recall, which is funny considering the reality of the situation is I believe Margaret never did actually say that he had ADD. I believe the story is that Danny was the one to actually say that to him. Yeah, he was clearly just projecting anything negative onto Margaret at this point, saying, did you or did you not? As soon as you saw me, did you tell me I had ADD? Is that true or is that false? Only for him to once again not even wait for her response and proceed to say, don't ask me such a stupid question, man. Later saying, I don't want to talk to you and don't talk to me. I don't want to talk to you, man. That's it. Where again, it's funny that Jeff proceeds to try to make a comment about how he's never seen something like this before, only for Judd to then interrupt him as well, with Jeff clearly loving all this. Like, you clearly tell Jeff realizing how great TV this is all is, even though I'm sure part of him was also kind of frustrated just how Judd wasn't letting him talk. But again, at this point, the entire tribe was just laughing at this. And again, clearly the entire group was just looking at this as a joke at this point, as again, there's no way to look at it otherwise. But again, this evolves into talking about Judd flipping once again, with Stephanie backing him up, saying, why wouldn't Judd talk to his new tribe? It's R-worded, because again, she needed to say that again. But either way, again, incredible tribal here from a character perspective. Probably one of the biggest showcases of a singular character in Survivor history. Again, just being such an incredible moment here for Judd on the show that, again, sadly, obviously comes from a pretty forgotten about season, though, again, is still a moment that, to me, stands the test of time. And again, clearly, Margaret was getting voted out here, where it ends up being a unanimous vote, as you would expect. Though we do get some strong voting confessionals here from Judd telling Margaret that if she doesn't leave this jungle now, it isn't soon enough. Get out now. When the way he says now is so funny to me and how over the top it is. Obviously, Margaret call him rude, profane, and a bully, and that no one like you deserves $1 million, which he won't get it. But again, Margaret's voted out there. We then cut to the Yaksha tribal, which is, again, very weird to get following this, where, obviously, again, we had a very entertaining tribal of Nakum, only for us to get a more ho-hum affair of Yaksha. Kind of obvious where this is going to go, though it is very funny that we see Jeff literally talking about the same thing, literally bringing up sportsmanship to Gary, only for Gary to not bite in the way that Margaret and Judd did, and simply just saying a simple yes, that they have sportsmanship with no further discussion beyond that. But again, we also get like a very weird moment of like Bobby John talking about how Brian is a good old boy and that he would be a great neighbor for some reason. Which again, it's funny that Bobby John's like complimenting Brian on his way out here, only for Brian to vote for him, saying that this is the outwit part of Outplay Outlast, where again, he was fully thinking that this 3-2-1 plan was coming to fruition, only for it to be a unanimous vote instead. Though there is an additional aspect of this tribal in the fact that, as mentioned earlier, Rafe is watching this tribal, and like in previous seasons, he's able to give immunity to a member of the opposite tribe, which, again, I never loved this aspect of the show. I just don't know why they just didn't allow both tribes to play for individual immunity. I think that just works better, but again, this is a spot where Rafe theoretically could have saved Brian, though, again, he had to write down a name of the person he wants to save before the votes end up happening, to which it's not really explained how exactly it would have worked if Rafe ended up actually giving immunity to the person that got the majority of the votes, where it's not explained if this would have worked like what the hidden immunity idol would later work, where all of Brian's votes gets nullified, and Bobby John would have been the one to go for one vote, or if they would have done a revote. Again, it's not really explained here, but ultimately it doesn't matter, as Rafe ends up getting immunity to Gary anyway, obviously Gary being the person he was closest to. And also, I know that there was supposedly this rivalry between Rafe and Brian that didn't make the show, that again kind of stemmed from the fact that they were so similar. They were both like these super fans around the same age, and they just never really trusted each other, to where Brian, again, was never really going to get that immunity here from Rafe. Now with that, let's obviously talk about the booths, starting it off with Margaret. And Margaret's a player here that I thought actually got a pretty decent edit from the very beginning, and was someone that I think would have been looked at as an Edric frontrunner from that first episode, though obviously in the time following that, her edit becomes a lot more negative, though at the same time, still again, obviously the foil to Judd, who is definitely a much more villainous figure, to where Margaret ends up being a pretty interesting character on this season, one that I actually thought had some pretty fun confessionals at points, and again, was obviously a source of conflict, to where, well, obviously not the greatest player in the grand scheme of things, definitely a player that definitely brought some value to the show and obviously provided for one of the best character moments in the history of the show in her fight with Judd. And now for Brian, and Brian's someone that I think is probably one of the more remembered players from the season, obviously someone that gets brought up as this kind of screwed over pre-merger that had a lot of potential, and again, I see that for sure. I do think he definitely is someone that feels very new school coded. I think if Brian were to come back in the modern day, it would actually be a really interesting return. However, I do think Brian's game on this specific season is probably a tad overrated. Again, it felt like Brian was actually kind of towards the bottom of the pecking order the entire time. And again, I'll give him credit for surviving over Blake, but I think he's someone that, again, kind of is able to talk up his game a lot more than what was the reality, where I don't think he really did too much that really played a major factor into the season, where most things he seemed to attempt to do either, again, kind of worked out for him, not necessarily because of involvement, or he just like actually failed at things. Yeah, again, it doesn't really feel like the show really focuses on those things, to where, again, I think he probably gets remembered too fondly as an effective player, yet he is someone that definitely had potential in the game, and I think he is someone that definitely I would like to see play again, yet obviously at this point it's very unlikely considering how far it's been since the season and how, again, not loved Guatemala is in the grand scheme of things. But now for episode 7, which is, again, a bit more of a tame episode from the one that we just had, though one that still had some pretty unique moments within it. But throughout it, we don't get that much content from Nakum, to where obviously we do get a reaction to the Margaret vote, with Judd thanking his tribe for voting her out and saying that he put her in her place and that he wasn't going to take it like a wuss, and that he's in actuality a giant teddy bear, only for Jamie to talk about how Judd is someone that he could take to the end and beat in the jury vote, which is actually some decent content here for Jamie, which again doesn't last, but I think the fact that Jamie seems to be aware of his jury prospects and be forward thinking enough to think of Judd as someone that he could take to the end and be, which again, I don't know if that actually would have been true, as Jamie will proceed to obviously not have the greatest jury prospects in the days to come, though again, I thought it was actually some decent insight there from Jamie into him at least having, again, a somewhat rational strategic mind, at least in that sense. But anyway, we do get a reward challenge in this episode, a very strange challenge of them having to like wrap material around their bodies and connect themselves to the other tribe members, then unspool all of them, and again, this was just a very weird challenge, but we do see Shaw pretty easily winning here, to where they end up winning chocolate and a zipline tour over a jungle, which very weird combination of things. And we do spend a lot of time on the ziplining reward here, which I just found mostly boring. And we do get Brandon narrating the chocolate feast for some reason. Again, just Brandon getting more superfluous content. But either way, following that, we get content from Nakum of Rafe making a deck of cards using leaves. Again, how riveting of content. This does transition to probably one of the most unique scenes in Survivor history, where we end up seeing Yaksha paddling to Nakum with the reveal that it's Danny's birthday and that she wants to invite the others to have a pool party, as she's big on birthday parties. Obviously inviting them over to their pool and giving them leftover chocolate, which I'll say just as a whole, like, I'm shocked producers allowed this to happen, where obviously I assume production must have given them the go-ahead to do this, and they probably thought it was something like unique here, and that's probably why they allowed it. But I think them, again, being given food without having earned it is something I'm kind of surprised the producers allowed in particular. But again, this ends up being just a very weird scene, as there's clearly this like weird tension between Nakum and Yaksha, where Shaw seemed to be genuinely just extending an olive branch here, only for Nakum to respond with such hostility here. And I do love like Bobby John of all people talking about how today is about fellowship and that chiefs would communicate with each other and then be at war later on, which it's like, thank you, Bobby John, for the history lesson. But again, we do see multiple people from Nakum just being annoyed that the other tribe even came to visit, with Jamie saying why they come here, with Rafe shockingly like knowing what's happening, saying that maybe they want to invite us to their pool, which is again kind of a weird take. It says that like I don't get how they didn't just assume that this could have been a merge of some sort. But again, we see Jamie not wanting to go, though Steph says what's the worst that can happen, because obviously Steph just wants the food. All Cindy says, don't let them sway you with a peace offering, and why would we hang out with the people we want to get rid of, which I find kind of weird in the sense that like, how did Cindy get so loyal to this group all of a sudden? Again, she clearly was on the bottom And this other group is mostly comprised of people that she started the game with, where again, it's not really explained like how these dynamics really played out. But either way, it is very clear that these post-swap tribes here end up being pretty solidified against each other at this point. And again, we see Jamie just being annoyed on the side of the party the entire time, like a child pouting about wanting to go home, to which he eventually ends up saying that we have to go back now, to where they end up leaving early, and Stefan's being annoyed, saying that he was so shady, and Jamie ends up saying that you were too friendly over there, with Steph saying that he's freaking out and that he's losing it, with this clearly being the start of this negative edit for Jamie, where really from this point on, he does kind of come off unhinged on the show, with him like clearly being set up for a fall. But anyway, on Yaksha, we do end up getting some content here around the tribe's injuries, with the reveal that Bobby John hurt his shoulders from that boulder challenge, to which we get probably one of the most disgusting sequences in the history of the show, seeing Bobby John attempting to take off his shirt here, with his shirt being stuck to his wounds and him having to rip it off, clearly infected. And we follow that up with another insane scene of him in the pool with little fish eating his dead skin, with Bobby John actually using it as bait as he tries to eat the small fish that are eating his skin. And again, that's so disgusting. But either way, we get set up here of Amy needs to win immunity because she obviously knows she goes home if they lose. But we do get a fun character moment from this, with her talking to Gary, saying that she's not gonna lie, he can, which I don't know why you're giving him permission to campaign against you, but this leads to, again, a funny tangent here of her talking about how she'll kick his ass afterwards. Well, she'll look up Gary Hawkins and call the locals, and that if he's an ex-professional football player, that I will beat you down like a stepchild, which I'll say, again, probably a little problematic of a thing to say, but still, again, said in a pretty fun way here. Ends up being a fun character moment for Amy. Oh, well, Gary has a very funny response in confessional, talking about trying to keep a straight face, and says that she'll never find Gary Hawkins because there isn't one, and that she'll be searching for years, which again is kind of a funny culmination to that storyline. But either way, we get to the immunity challenge, a very integral challenge that should really determine the entire game, which is kind of lame, as it's kind of a luck-based challenge here, as most of it is really revolving around finding puzzle pieces in the dirt, which obviously it's mostly you just stumbling upon them. And while they obviously have to solve a puzzle immediately following that, the challenge was largely just determined by how quickly they were able to find the pieces. And we do see Nakum end up winning here, and now having the numbers coming into the merge up 6-4, outnumbering the other tribe by 2, which in a way I do think is a bit unfair here, that the New York Shah here kind of gets screwed over by being swapped into a smaller group, where again, for the original Nakum on Yaksha, it is weird how they got disadvantaged for being the winningest tribe, where the tribe with the most numbers coming into the swap was always going to get the majority on the tribe with the least amount of numbers, which again is a weird precedent to set here. Again, the fact that the losingest tribe in the pre-swap here ends up benefiting actually from being on a majority swap tribe and now having the numbers come into the merge. And obviously, again, that group had to flip over Judd to get those numbers, so it's not like they were just handed it entirely. But again, it just feels like a bit of an unlucky break here for Bobby John, Brandon, and Danny to have ended up landing on a smaller tribe, leading to them coming into the merge down in numbers, despite actually winning more challenges in the pre-swap. Where had they swapped positions and, again, been on the tribe that had one more player, they would have come into the merge at worst tied in numbers, which at least gives them a fighting shot at the merge. While I was like, at this point, they're down 6-4, and again, should be in a spot where they're essentially led to slaughter, which again, them getting a bit of a raw deal there. But in the lead up to the vote, is pretty apparent where this is going, though we do try to add some suspense here with focus around Bobby John and him talking about how much he needs to make the jury and saying that it'll be a lifelong dream, which is like, I mean, Survivor's not even been around for your entire lifetime. And even then, it's not like you were even a big Survivor fan before going on the show, so I don't know why this is a lifelong dream for you. But yeah, I do get the notion, obviously, that this is his second time playing, and for him to be someone that never made the jury on his 2 appearances would, again, kind of be a sucky feeling. But again, it leads into Amy clearly knowing she has uphill battle and probably screwed here, but she says she's not giving up, where we do see her going to Danny and asking her if she has any shot, with Danny saying that she would hate to vote out Bobby John as he didn't make the merge last time, but him and Steph have a huge advantage, which I don't think they actually do in this spot, where again, it feels like both were drawing dead, but again, you do you. And what I find funny is that this wasn't even like Danny seemingly really propping up Bobby John as a potential target. It just felt like her just throwing out Bobby John's like really the only possible name she would even consider voting for. But obviously the show runs with it here, and we do have Amy saying that she can get Gary, see Gary, say that he'll be on board as long as you have Danny. But once again, Danny's in this power position here to decide who goes, and again, we do see Danny saying it's a hard decision, she doesn't know what to do, where we do see her and Brandon talking about the vote, talking about how Amy is more deserving than Bobby John for whatever reason. Again, don't love how much talk there is about deserving on this season. But again, finally, this leads to more content from Brandon, where, again, typically you would think that with Danny being in the power position and her obviously going on to win, that, again, she would get a lot of the focus in this scene, but really she doesn't. And a lot of that is simply because, again, supposedly she didn't really talk through her strategy in confessionals. And instead we get Brandon talking about this dilemma, struggling over the concept of wanting to vote for those who are deserving over who's in your alliance, which, again, really has him playing into like the morals of playing the game, with him saying that you don't have to lie to play Survivor, but you do it to get one step closer to the $1 million, which would have been a decent winner quote there, but again, clearly not. Though, again, I think coming into his boot episode, I would have been looking at Brandon as Edgic frontrunner at this point. But anyway, we do get the tribal, where we do get a lot of focus here around how close this group is, with the tribe really turning into a love fest after Brian left. Though, again, the vote is pretty obvious, just a unanimous Amy vote as expected, with the reveal now that they're not going back to camp, and instead they're going to Nakum, because they're now merged, to which they're given red buffs to hand out to the others, which I find kind of weird. Really just weird in general how they handle the merge here, where, again, it's a unique thing, obviously. And I feel like this is a point in Survivor where they just like trying new things, but again, just kind of awkward to just have them show up at camp in the middle of the night and say, hey, we're merged. Where I still think it's better for production to announce their merge than, again, players just randomly showing up at camp. But either way, with that, we ended up obviously losing Amy, and Amy was an incredible character on this season, probably an understated character in Survivor history, where, again, just another one of these people that kind of gets forgotten about because Guatemala isn't that talked about, but someone that definitely brought a lot of fun character moments on this season. Also, again, like, was very perseverant on this season, again, despite her injury, still continued trying, and even, again, did well in that one challenge, which is a great moment for her. And she's someone that I know, again, was supposedly in the running for Heroes vs. Villains, to where, while obviously it would have been weird if she was on that cast, I do think she's someone that, again, would have been a pretty fun returnee at some point, though obviously, again, that time has passed and it's very unlikely now, though, again, still definitely a character that I think is a bit forgotten about in Survivor history, where I do think she is a pretty fun presence on this season. But now for episode 8, the Merge episode, which is, again, another one of these episodes that, again, while the strategy of the episode is pretty clear cut, there ends up being some pretty fun character moments and some drama along the way that ends up making it still pretty interesting, though. I'm going to start off with old Yaksha actually stopping before getting to the camp, creating a game plan to act like servants and work hard around camp, because I guess they think that's going to gain them favor. Like, ultimately, again, it's never going to do much in the game, but it becomes pretty clear that, again, they're pretty disappointed to be coming into the merge, not just because they're down in numbers, but also because they don't really want to be spending time with these people, with Bobby John instantly saying they can't even be around Steph for 5 minutes without wanting to vomit, or around Jamie without wanting to kick him out. So, again, clearly their plan's going to work out very well, but it is funny to see them wake up the Nakum tribe and tell them that they're merged, where we awkwardly see them celebrating in the dark with Bobby John lighting a fire, only for Jamie to instantly cause drama here, saying that there's no room in the shelter and hope you don't mind sleeping outside, with Bobby John saying that he wanted to knock all of his teeth outside his head. Either way, we see them end up naming the tribe Jakum, mixing Yaksha and Nakum. Again, how original. They'll say, very weird, they didn't just go Yakum. Like, why use the end of both of the names? But either way, it is also here where we get the reveal of what is ultimately the biggest impact that the season has on Survivor history, with the reveal that there is a small immunity idol hidden in the woods, with them specifically being told that it's 6 inches tall and made of stone, which is kind of interesting that they were told what it looks like. But again, they are told that it can be used at any time to save yourself, though must be used before the vote and expires at the final 4. Obviously, rules that will later change across Survivor history, though obviously, again, the first hidden immunity idol, with us getting a very notable confession from Jamie saying that we're supposed to find a little immunity idol this big, obviously, again, referring to it being small, in a jungle this big, and then we zoom out to the entire jungle, where obviously, again, hidden immunity idols are obviously just a staple of Survivor nowadays. Can't really imagine a modern Survivor season without idols, and this is obviously the first time they were ever in play. Again, probably the biggest impact this season has on future seasons, and one that I'm kind of surprised it took them this long to really implement, as it becomes clear, obviously, that they're trying to figure out ways to shake up the game. But you would think that the concept of, again, a second way to have immunity outside of immunity necklace would be a pretty basic concept. Yeah, again, it obviously took 11 seasons to get to this point, and obviously at this point it's not really the idol that we know now. I mean, the rules of this idol are, again, vastly different. First, in the fact that, again, it's good until the final 4, obviously, again, later than modern Survivor, though, to be fair, again, this is at a point where we have a final 2, but obviously more integral piece of it is the fact that it has to be used before they vote. aka making them immune coming into the vote, essentially just being a second immunity necklace, which obviously functions very differently than the modern idol, which actually nullifies votes that are cast for you. And through that, obviously gives the opportunity for bigger swings in the game, allows for a complete power shift, where this really just saves one individual person and, again, kind of moves the target onto the next person, where, again, unless it was utilized in a spot where that person was the last in a series of a pagonging and for some reason they hadn't plotted out what their next move would be. Again, this is a type of idol here that obviously it shakes up the game to a degree. Obviously, again, it gives the opportunity for one person to save themselves, but it ultimately doesn't really shake up the game enough. And again, at the end of the day, this is a very underpowered version of the idol that they obviously instantly recognize that that's the case and later change it for the following season. And obviously in that season, they kind of do the opposite and end up giving it too much power before eventually finding that right balance at the time Survivor Fiji. But yeah, at this point, again, it just ends up being a very underpowered idol here, feeling very similar to kind of the history of the veto in Big Brother, where there it felt like they thought the idea of using the veto on yourself was too powerful, only to realize that it isn't. And it feels like here this is a kind of a similar position where they probably thought the notion of just having another immunity necklace was good enough, when ultimately it doesn't really shake up the game enough. But again, they'll obviously shake that up as the seasons go along. But either way, we see everyone here searching for the idol, with Gary saying that if he found it, he wouldn't tell anybody, which is a bit of foreshadowing. Oh, we see Brandon saying it's like a needle in a haystack and that he needs to find it as he has a target on his head, where he clearly knows it's either him or Bobby John that are the first to go. With Bobby John also looking here, saying that he's going to be looking an hour a day for the idol, which is like, that's it. I feel like, again, if this was modern Survivor, I feel like you'd be looking for it until you found it, especially in the position that Bobby John is in, where, again, you know you're on the bottom. But and humorously, we do see him literally just walking right past the idol, not seeing it. Though, again, this is interesting also in the fact that the first ever idol here was one that was given out without a true clue, where, again, obviously Russell gets credited eventually for being the first person to ever find an idol without a clue, and that being this big innovative moment for the show at the time. Though it is interesting that the first ever time that the idol was in play, it initially didn't have a clue involved outside just the fact that it is hidden somewhere in the jungle. But we also get a montage here of the Nakum members looking for the idol with no one ending up finding it, with the sequence ending with Rafe having accidentally put his hand in a hornet's nest, and we see him running away from them, which is kind of a funny shot. But here we do end up seeing Bobby John talking to Stephanie, with him telling her that he just wants to make the jury, with Stephanie saying that she wants him to make the jury too, and will do everything in her power to do that, where clearly, again, this is Bobby John throwing Brandon under the bus, where clearly he knows Brandon would be the other target. And again, this obviously sets up that Brandon is the clear target if he doesn't win immunity at this point. But also, again, very funny that Bobby John gets Stephanie to keep him in the game, only for him to still hate Stephanie and not want her to win at the end. And also really funny that Stephanie ends up being the one to get Bobby John to the jury, only for him to be very anti-her at the end of the game. But either way, we also get a lot of content here revolving around the massive split here between these two groups, with Odiok Shah really working hard around camp, getting really propped up as these big underdogs, and talking about how the Nakum tribe isn't friendly and how they're not one happy family. And Danny compares themselves to slaves, saying that they know they're on the chopping block, where, again, it felt pretty clear that we were meant to be rooting for the Yaksha tribe, to where, again, that definitely was a sign that one of the Yaksha members might go on the win, with the Nakum tribe just really being villainized here, where, again, we do see the Yaksha really going off on their own, going fishing, which, to be fair, is not great gameplay there to really just completely isolate themselves. But we see them, again, talking about wanting to go back to their old camp and chill out like they used to, which actually would have been kind of insane if they allowed them to do that. But again, we talk about how Nakum just complains all the time and are so negative and don't do anything, which is actually kind of funny considering this is literally Yaksha complaining about Nakum complaining. But either way, while they're gone, we see Nakum again come off even more villainous, eating food while they're gone, and Judd saying that they're so dumb for going together and they must be plotting their next move, saying that whoever catches the biggest fish is the next to go, where, again, shouldn't it be the opposite? Wouldn't you want to keep around the person that catches the biggest fish, because they might catch you more fish? But and we see them lay out the game plan of voting out Brandon, then Bobby John, then Danny, which, interesting that Gary was lined up to be the last to go, where obviously, again, major reason for that is because he was part of the starting tribe that has the majority in this group. But obviously, again, things end up changing for him coming to the following episode. But really, out of this entire group, Rafe is the only one to really be redeemed in any sort of way, where he talks about how he's not cool with his tribe's attitude, and saying that he has the sad realization that he's part of the axis of evil, and says that bashing people to bring group unity is not a pretty way of playing this game, where it really just feels like Rafe is meant to be the only person from this group that we're meant to be sympathetic towards. Or from an Edgic perspective, I think Rafe would have been the only viable winner candidate from this group coming out of this episode, where realistically, I think I personally would have looked at as Rafe as probably the front runner to win the game, throughout this entire post-merge phase. But beyond that, we end up seeing the players hanging out in the pool, which is now just in the middle of the lake for some reason, where I guess they can't dock it at the Nakum camp, which is weird that this could have even been a reward for a Nakum camp then, but where they have to row out to it every time. But either way, they end up getting tree mail with the reveal that the immunity challenge is going to be them carrying around a pot on their head, where we get a montage of everyone practicing, which we surprisingly get a decent amount of on this season, with Brandon saying that he's not out of this yet, though he clearly will be soon. But it's also here where we get Steph being upset at how they weren't given food at the merge feast, saying that there's always food when people come together, and this is the first time they're merging without anything, which is technically not true. But we have Jamie proceeding to say that it's R-worded, that there's no feast, because, again, early 2000s. While Steph says an idol's cool, but I'd rather have a feast, because I can't believe Stephanie wants food. Either way, we get to the immunity challenge, where I can't believe it, this all led to something, because they see the merge feast, where Jeff says that it's true that part of tradition is a feast at the merge, but now it comes with a twist, where to get the merge feast, they have to sit out of the immunity challenge, which is interesting that I believe this is the first time that this happens in Survivor, where obviously this becomes a staple in future seasons, sitting out for a reward. But pretty brutally they do it in this spot, where, again, this was already one of the hardest seasons in the history of the show, and from the not give everybody food on the offset seems pretty rough. But I do fully get why they do this twist, where obviously this incentivizes the majority to sit out, obviously making it more likely that the minority wins immunity. And we do see the likes of Jamie, Lydia, Rafe, and Stephanie sitting out here, all while the entire minority play in the challenge alongside Cindy and Judd, where I do think if I was in the game, I probably would have sat out in this spot, especially considering how tough this season was, where, again, for Judd and Cindy, it didn't really seem like it was really worth participating in the challenge. Also, even for someone like Danny, who coming into the challenge was talking about how she has no shot because she can't balance a pot on her head. For some reason, she decides to compete as well, when, again, she's also not really in danger. But though I guess theoretically, if Brandon were to win immunity and Bobby John had the immunity idol, I guess Danny would be the next to go. But again, it's still a spot where I think I personally would have took my chances and sat out here. But either way, the challenge ends up starting off as an endurance challenge of them having to balance a pot on their head, where the last person surviving wins immunity, though if they go after 1 hour, there ends up being a tiebreaker. Where, again, just another point where they just, for some reason, had a tiebreaker here. And I do wonder if the 1 hour benchmark was something added here because they didn't want immunity challenges to go super long, like in Palau, to where this is kind of start of them like actively trying to make endurance challenges shorter. But really throughout that entire 1 hour period, Danny is the only person to drop out, meaning we get a 5-way tiebreaker, which is essentially just racing up the pyramid while trying to keep the pot in your head, with the first person to the top wins immunity, where we do get a pretty tight race here between Bobby John, Brandon, and Gary, though both Bobby John and Brandon have dropping before the end, with Gary ending up making it to the top and winning immunity, which I assume probably put a bigger bullseye on his back in the grand scheme of things. But also throughout this challenge, we do get a lot of drama here, where during the endurance portion, when those that sat out were eating, we do see Jamie talking some smack here about how Bobby John and Brandon know they are the next to go, and talks about Judd is the one protecting their lead, which, again, neglecting Cindy there, which is weird and should have been very telling to Cindy. But again, it does lead to some bickering here between Bobby John and Jamie, with Jamie saying that he thought it was one tribe, and Jamie saying, you know it's not one tribe, so why say that? With Bobby John proceeding to say, because I can, and I will, and want to, which is such an awkward response, and saying that I'm not going to let you big boy me, which is, again, also a weird phrase. But again, people end up being clearly annoyed by Jamie's trash talking here, with even Jeff calling him out for just trying to rub it in, with Rafe being upset here in particular, saying he feels bad. We can clearly tell that this plays a major factor into Rafe's decision making. But once we get back to camp, we do actually see Judd being upset at Jamie for his talking, of all people, saying you should just shut up, man, and I can't even listen to you right now. Oh, Danny ends up calling Jamie cocky and arrogant, saying it was a slap in the face. All Cindy says he's immature, and calls out that, again, when Judd is telling you should stop talking, that definitely says something. There again, we do see Rafe here really contemplating sticking with Jamie, talking to Danny about not knowing who he's going to vote for, saying he can't respect himself if he goes far with Jamie. We see Gary tell him to do the right thing, to vote out Jamie, because Brandon's more deserving than Jamie, because they have to talk about deserving again. Cindy talks about how she'd rather hurt Jamie's feelings than Brandon's. Also mentions the fact that, again, they still technically have the numbers. Even if they take out Jamie in this spot, they'll still be up up 5-4. While Cindy also talks about how she'd rather hurt Jamie's feelings than Brandon's, to where, again, did feel like this was a genuine consideration at this point. And we do see Bobby John campaigning against Jamie to Stephanie and Judd, making it clear that he wouldn't want to reward Jamie with the win, and also that he wanted to step off the endurance challenge and smash his pot on Jamie's head. But really all this should just make Judd and Stephanie actually want to keep Jamie around even more, as this is obviously just making it even more clear that Jamie can't win a jury vote and that they would beat him at the end, where ultimately, again, this is just such an ineffective way of campaigning, even though ultimately, again, the move does eventually happen. But this ends up leading into a very awkward conversation between Bobby John and Jamie, with Jamie telling him that your head's not on the chopping block, it's Brandon's head on the chopping block, with the reveal that Brandon is also right there, which is very awkward. And we proceed to see Jamie walking away, which is, again, some great social tact there. But after Jamie walks away, we do see Bobby John telling Brandon that Jamie is the one going home tonight, as Steph and Judd are on board, which they're not. But again, clearly Brandon seemed to really believe this. He still looked pretty defeated, though does say that he's going to crap his pants if it works out like that, which, spoiler, won't work out like that. But again, this leads into Brandon looking for the idol, where I assume this is something they would have done a bit more on this season had the idol been in play for longer, of really showing the assumed boot looking for the idol to add suspense, which I also wonder if that was also a tactic that they were going to utilize, is the notion that you don't really have to mislead the audience as much anymore, because now there's always a suspense of if they have the idol or not. But ultimately here, obviously, it doesn't lead to anything. But we do get the tribal, where we get a pretty fun continuation of the Bobby John Jamie feud. Kind of the culmination of it, considering they seemingly mend their relationship in the following round. But here we see Bobby John say that it was no class from Jamie today, and that he has no class, with Jamie, again, being very insulted by this, saying, I have class, only for Bobby John to say, just shut up. I mean, God. Which, again, he says it as if he's like Napoleon Dynamite or something. But again, Jamie says that it's disrespectful to say I have no class, and I didn't disrespect him, leading to this very weird debate over like Bobby John being overconfident because he didn't ask for immunity during the Brian boot, which I really don't even understand why any of this come up. And it is really funny that Jeff is just shaking his head throughout all this. But ultimately, again, we get to the vote where Jeff asks for the immunity idol, though no one has found it. And as we get to the voting, we have Bobby John having, again, a funny confessional here for Jamie, talking about Southern pride, and some of that is being a Southern gentleman, and no, you don't have any class at all. Which, again, just feels like a ridiculous thing to say, but ultimately ends up being a 6-4 Brandon vote, which, again, is a bit surprising edgically, in the sense that I do think Brandon would have been a front runner coming into this episode, though at the same time, logically in the game, it makes a lot of sense here. Though as he leaves, we see him tell Danny that you're the best sister I never had, and we see Danny really sobbing, to where really this entire dynamic between Brandon and Danny ends up being severely under-edited on this season, where it's clear from Exit Press that, again, they were a very tight duo, and really if the old Yaksha had come into the merge of the numbers, very likely Danny and Brandon end up being the final two of this season. Yeah, again, ultimately this ends up being a dynamic that is simply just not really shown that much, and again, I do wonder how much of that's because Danny's lack of strategic confessionals, but even then, we could have gotten it a lot more from Brandon's perspective, but even then, we don't really get that. We just get, again, kind of these narrational confessionals from Brandon instead, where ultimately, again, kind of weird they didn't really showcase this on the show, considering it's a very important relationship for Danny, and it definitely could have been this, like, Jeremy Natalie Anderson sort of moment for her, though ultimately, again, ends up just being completely underdeveloped on the show. But anyway, with that, we lose Brandon. We're just another one that I think kind of gets forgotten just because it's Survivor Guatemala, but again, he is an incredible narrator on this season, to where while I don't know how acclimated he necessarily is for the social strategy aspects of the game, where it felt like he was somebody that was very much struggling with the morality of the game, I do think he's someone that definitely brought a lot to the table in terms of just having these very witty confessionals and having these very sharp one-liners that end up making him a really fun character here, to where while I do think he ends up being, again, kind of a forgotten about character in Survivor history, I do think he is someone that I think definitely brings some entertainment when you actually watch the season itself, and you actually get a decent amount of him on the season as well. But now for episode 9, I know they're pretty solid character-focused episode here, one that starts off with some drama right off the bat with Jamie, again, being upset at how he was said to have no class, but saying he's not angry, his feelings are just hurt, with Bobby John really just doubling down on this, saying that it really got to him because he knows it's the truth and that he showed no class. With this, again, leading to this bickering here between Jamie and Bobby John, with Jamie being upset, saying that it's like he's being called white trash and it broke his heart, saying to the others, I don't know how this wouldn't hurt your feeling. Always see Bobby John, again, try to mend fences here and shake Jamie's hand, despite the fact that Jamie is still clearly upset while they're doing so. But ultimately, again, we have Rafe talking about how personally Jamie took it, saying that he's blaming Bobby John and should be using this to learn, and if not, he'll change up his game. With, again, this already setting up the fact that Rafe just clearly wants Jamie out here and is very willing to take him out already. Where again, just kind of felt like Jamie was on borrowed time at this point, where now that they have a clear majority, it just felt like kind of a no-brainer for Jamie to be one the next few to go. But anyway, we cut to the morning where we get some more villainous content here for Judd, with him talking about how other than food, everything's great, and that they're up 6-3, and that Bobby, John, Danny, and Gary know that they're vulnerable and on the bottom. Cutting to him laughing with Jamie and Steph in like kind of a villainous sort of way, in a spot where, and kind of interesting that Steph is being lumped into this kind of villainous edit at this point. But we do end up seeing the minority here looking for an idol, talking about it as if they're doing so as a group, despite the fact that, again, this is an idol that doesn't really benefit a group, where, again, obviously this is the modern version of the idol. Having the idol can, again, swing the entire game, and it benefits you to be looking for it as a group. But in this spot, it really doesn't, where really it just, like, leads to the next one, the pecking order going. So again, for someone like Danny in particular, she should not be wanting the other people to find the idol. But this does lead to a pretty good Gary confessional, talking about his football experience, of how he played Detroit one year and was down, but won in the last part, and that's how he's approaching the game, which, to be fair, could essentially be a metaphor for Danny's game. Though at this point, again, from an Edgic perspective, I think this definitely would have made me look at Gary as this upcoming frontrunner at this point. But ultimately, we do get to the reward challenge, it being one that will test your ability with an indigenous weapon, where obviously it's just a accuracy challenge. The closest to the target wins. Though the interesting part about all this is the fact that they're playing for food, but everyone will end up getting to eat. But what you eat is determined on how well you do. Probably done here to make up for the fact that there was no merge feast, where this is obviously a modification of the reward that Rupert won in Survivor All-Stars, where Rupert got to decide who ate what, and that really exposed a lot of social dynamics, where here they decide to essentially strip out the social strategy aspects of it and essentially just make it based on where you place, which is kind of lame. But I don't mind this style of reward. I actually think it's still interesting to get everyone involved in some sort of way, though at the same time it probably wastes more time than what it's worth, and probably would only be good to have on a more character-based season like Guatemala. Over again, like if this was done in a hyper-strategic season, it probably just would be a waste of time. But we do end up seeing Judd here winning the challenge, getting steak and lobster along with an idol clue, again the first proper idol clue in the history of Survivor. Oh, we see Jamie land in 4th, but decide to relinquish his spot to take last place to make up for yesterday, with Jeff allowing that for whatever reason, with Rafe saying that this shows that Jamie earned a lot, even though he later proceeds to say that he doesn't think he did this out of the goodness of his heart and still decides to target Jamie. So again, that didn't really matter. Or again, I just think Rafe was just always going to be targeting Jamie at this point in the game. But we see them head to a lodge to get their meals, which really just felt like a random person's residence, where we just see like puppies running around. But Judd ends up getting the center table on his own with a massive plate of food, along with also an open bar, which he surely won't abuse. But it's here where we get the reveal that he'll also be allowed to share his food and the open bar with 2 other players, deciding on Bobby, John, and Stephanie for some reason, not really explained. Now again, obviously Steph makes sense considering it's one of his closest allies, and I guess he didn't want to pick Jamie considering Jamie's sacrifice, though again, why did he pick Bobby John? Either way, we see everyone being given out their rewards, but kind of funny that we see Lydia the fishmonger getting a fish. We see Jamie being in a spot where he would have gotten a burger had he not sacrificed his spot, but instead just gets nuts, which is just kind of random. Really, this ends up being a reward here that really just sucks for the players that aren't given the top prize, as we have them having to wait for the others to finish, to where we see Gary just like staring at them the entire time, which is funny. And obviously we see Judd and Bobby John get very drunk, where we see them heading back to camp, weirdly smoking cigars, which I find it weird they were given cigars, to which we proceed to see Bobby John try to move a stump for firewood, with that stump being a 30-foot tree, which is funny. Judd ends up throwing up in the shelter, which is obviously just not a great look there. Though in the morning, we see Judd now with his idol clue that, again, everyone knows he has, so again, definitely could put a target on his back. Though for some reason, he proceeds to say that if he finds the idol, he'll definitely be in the top 4, which I don't fully know why he thinks that, which I guess he thinks he has a top 5 at this point, like maybe the majority minus Lydia, and then he thinks he can use the idol at 5 to get the 4. Again, it's really just not explained. But anyway, he says that he can't keep his clue a secret and decides to show Steph his idol clue, with the reveal that the idol is not on the ground, only for him to do the most Judd thing possible and proceed to tell the rest of the tribe that he can't give too much away, but he will give them the clue that the idol is definitely on the ground. saying that he doesn't have a problem lying to them, as that's what this game is about, which is clearly an opinion that he'll definitely hold. But following this, we do proceed to get a lot more focus around Jamie, with us seeing the first of these sequences of Rafe and Jamie playing Mancala, which ends up being Jamie's time of talking strategy to Rafe, with him wanting Rafe to promise to not screw him over, with Rafe proceeding to say Jamie is paranoid, which is like, is he paranoid if you're actually planning on turning on him? But again, we end up seeing Jamie be portrayed very negatively here, particularly in his following conversations, where you see him going to Gary and telling him that Bobby John is next to go, with Gary proceeding to say to him that I'll vote with you today, because if I don't, I'm dead. Which leads to Gary finally saying in confessional that he would be stupid to not agree with this, as he doesn't want Jamie to get mad at him. Only first to cut to Jamie being mad at him, having clearly misheard what Gary said and thinks that Gary told him that he's voting for him tonight, instead of saying that I'm voting with you tonight. Clearly thinking Gary said that I'm voting for you tonight instead of voting with you tonight. If Steph instantly calling out that she thinks he just misunderstood what Gary said. This leads to Jamie being so gung-ho about wanting Gary out at this point, with Steph also just getting annoyed at how paranoid he's getting, saying that he's losing it in a real way out here, with this obviously being set up to Jamie being the target coming into the immunity challenge, where we do get the reveal that the immunity challenge will involve balancing, to where we weirdly again see Gary, Danny, and Rafe practicing for the challenge. But the challenge itself involves multiple rounds, with people getting eliminated every round, where round 1 has them having to all cross a balance beam while getting planks, with only 4 moving on to round 2, with those ending up being Steph, Gary, Jamie, and Rafe, while round 2 has them using those planks to cross a rope bridge, with only 2 moving on there, where we end up seeing Gary struggling there and proceeding to lose, leading to Jamie and Rafe moving on to the final part, which has them having to cross a 2-line rope bridge, with Jamie handily winning immunity there, obviously saving himself in the process, while Rafe really struggles and has a really fun fall, falling upside down. But again, Jamie's immunity win here obviously shakes up the strategy for this round, with Stephanie openly saying that she was ready to vote him out if he didn't win. But this obviously leads to Nakum creating their plan, with the decision to now vote out Gary over Bobby John, with Bobby John still being the backup, where I wonder if that'll be relevant. But again, obviously Gary moving up in the pecking order, probably because he performed better than Bobby John in the last 2 immunity challenges, to where we proceed to see Jamie telling Bobby John that he isn't going home tonight, only for Bobby John to proceed to attempt to target Stephanie, which is, again, funny, considering again, Stephanie is literally the reason why he's still in the game. But also it's funny in the fact that he's like really propping up Stephanie as this big threat, when the reality is Stephanie's probably one of the biggest goats on the board, and it's probably actually one of the only people that Jamie can actually beat in the game. But also, it makes no sense for Bobby John to be campaigning against Stephanie, considering Stephanie's also one of the only people that he can beat as a fellow returnee, where, again, none of this actually makes any sense. It really just feels like he's targeting Stephanie here just because he doesn't like her, which is, again, funny considering she's the main reason he's still there. But either way, we do see Gary obviously being the big target here, with Stephanie surprisingly being on board here despite having a very close relationship to Gary, talking about how huge of a threat he is because he's always in game mode. Only for Gary to talk to her and try to get her to promise to tell him when he's going home, which feels like something that you would definitely say if you had the immunity idol, though it's implied that he doesn't have it at this point. Though I wouldn't be shocked if this is like edited out, or if he was like planning on this just in the case he did find the immunity idol. But again, ultimately doesn't really work to his favor, as Steph ends up lying to him anyway, telling him that he'll be the last Shaw to go, which, to be fair, again, was the case before this round at least. But obviously things changed. But again, Gary seems to recognize the fact that he does need the idol, to where he ends up watching Judd looking for the idol. Shockingly, seeing Judd looking into the trees, where Gary says that if it's on the ground, why is he looking in the trees? Obviously realizing that Judd is lying. But we don't see Gary actually looking for the idol. We actually cut back to Gary returning to camp, with it being left open if he found it or not, leading into Tribal, where we do get this weird discussion over who's lied, and Gary saying that he hasn't told any lies, surely. All Judd says that he hasn't lied yet, but it might happen, which is like, why are you saying that? But also, again, funny considering Gary knows that he's lied. But either way, it's time to vote, and we get Jeff asking for the idol. Or get the reveal that Gary found the immunity idol, where he gets up, and Steph says, oh my god, I knew it, because that's definitely something Steph would say. Though again, interesting that the first ever idol play here ends up being in a spot where the actual idol find wasn't on the show. Now they do later show at the reunion. But again, interesting that they left it up for suspense here. Something that they don't really do that often. To be fair, it's very difficult to do so, where the only true opportunities you have to do something like this are in spots where, again, you find the idol right before Tribal, or if you want to do this like big flashback reveal, which is obviously not very Survivor-like, at least until the new era. It's where again, this obviously just kind of worked out in their favor. They were able to do something like this. Though, again, a very interesting portrayal of the first ever idol here. And again, it obviously does save Gary. He does successfully use it in a spot where he was in danger. Though, the problem is that, again, with this version of the idol, it just makes the vote even more obvious. And to be fair, again, even if it was the other version of the idol, they would have had enough votes to split between Bobby John and Gary. So Bobby John probably would have gone anyway. But at this point, just makes it a very clear-cut Bobby John vote. Though, again, it is interesting that after the Immunity Idol is played, we see Jeff shutting down any conversation, saying that you're not allowed to talk, where, again, I think they probably thought that would be a bigger thing, the aspect of players not being able to talk when after the Immunity Idol was found, though obviously, again, they clearly came up with a contingency plan, which probably would have played a bigger factor here if they were not specifically told about the idol, to where obviously this just allows them to counter it by having a backup plan, which, to be fair, the pecking order was just kind of obvious anyway. But it is interesting that through the vote here, we do see Jamie remorsefully voting for Bobby John, all while we see Stephanie saying, "I'm happy you made the jury," which is like, you shouldn't be. But Bobby John ends up being voted out here in a 6-2-1 vote, with Bobby John and Danny voting for Steph, all while Gary ends up voting for Cindy, which isn't really explained, though. And clearly it's a spot where Cindy is one of the people that was not on his OG tribe, like Steph. And again, he clearly just had a relationship with Steph, to where Cindy was just the easier option for him. But yeah, with that, we lose Bobby John, and Bobby John's probably one of the more random two-time players in the history of Survivor. Yeah, I actually do like Bobby John as a character. While I don't know how Bobby John would do in the modern day, I do think Bobby John's actually kind of an understated character in Survivor history, and just how awkward of a figure he can be. Again, his feud with Jamie is still probably one of the funniest rivalries in the history of the show, and he does have a lot of quirks to him that do make him a funny character. So where obviously a lot of the hype around him on the show is about how he's the hardest working survivor ever. A lot of that stuff I really don't care about. But what I do like from Bobby John are, again, these more funny little character moments we get from him along the way that makes him someone that I'm actually kind of happy we got to see him play again, as I actually think he probably actually provided more entertainment on this season than he did in his first appearance. But now for episode 10, an episode that does end up containing a power shift. Again, a breakup in the pagonging from these last couple episodes. So despite that, I actually think probably ends up being a weaker episode despite that, where, again, Guatemala is just such a character-focused season that I think despite the fact that, again, we do get an interesting vote off, I actually do think the last couple episodes probably has some better character moments within it, but it's still a pretty solid episode where we do start off with obviously the reaction to Gary finding the idol, with him revealing that he found it today, and Jamie proceeding to say that Gary is shady and he doesn't think he's a good guy, and being upset that he voted for Cindy and thinks that he's doing it to confuse them. Yes. We're, again, really funny that even Cindy doesn't seem to care that much, and instead we see Jamie being upset at her for not being mad at Gary, with Jamie saying, "Don't play in his games," which is really some crazy talk there. But we see Jamie talking to Gary for a very awkward fight here, again, accusing him of lying, only for Gary to say that he's not a liar, and now Jamie to say, "I guess we had the fight then," because Jamie's now upset at Gary for calling him a liar because he's, I guess, lying about Gary being a liar, which is very weird. And I love it, like Gary says, "Maybe you just don't hear well." Oh, Jamie says, "I'm mad too, just like you," and Gary says, "Hey, I'm not mad." Where, again, we see judges being confused over what the two are fighting about here, with him saying that Jamie's just saying things to say things, and talking about how Jamie's losing it and doesn't think Gary's a liar, which, that, again, is an opinion that surely won't change. But anyway, it takes us to a reward challenge, which they follow the trope that they do typically at the final 8 of having 2 teams of 4, which I don't know why this is something they like to do. But where do we see the teams comprising of 1 pair of men and 1 pair of women, which is, like, weirdly specific, as, again, what if they didn't have even genders? Like, why'd they even bother doing this? Like, obviously they just wouldn't have done this, but again, weird that they did do this, enforcing them to be paired up based on gender. But either way, ends up being a pretty physical challenge of them going through mud and obstacles to transport corn back and forth, with one of the teams here being pretty strong, of it being Gary, Judd, Steph, and Danny, that pretty easily win here, all while Lydia ends up really lagging behind for her team, with Jeff telling her to dig deep, but again, she ends up losing it for her team, with Jamie still wanting to finish the challenge, only for Cindy to be pissed, and Rafe to try to calm him down, which again is just a funny quirk of Jamie's. But back at camp, we do see Lydia apologizing for the challenge loss and proceed to list out all the things that they missed out on, which ends up annoying Jamie even more. We see Jamie and Rafe talking, with Jamie proposing a final 3 deal with Rafe and Judd, wanting him to swear to go to the final 3, only for Rafe to respond by saying that he's not 100% and that he hasn't thought about it, which is, again, not great to be declining a deal like this. But again, we see Jamie saying that he's getting scared and don't sucker me, with Rafe saying that he's letting the paranoia get to him. It's like, no, you literally just turned down a deal with him. Obviously, he has every right to be worried in this position. But either way, we then cut to the players on the reward, where we do spend a lot of time here with them getting an overnight stay at a mansion, weirdly greeted by the owner of the house. But they proceed to get 6 different flavors of Folgers coffee. What a great reward. We also get a lot of focus around the players showering, because we needed that, all while we follow that up with videos from home, which were pretty boring, but thank God Danny knows her dogs are okay. But here we also do see the group really bonding here, especially Danny and Steph, with them being very similar-minded people here, though very funny that this leads to talk about how much Stephanie can eat, because again, I don't know if you know this, but Stephanie likes food. But Gary obviously tries to use this to strategize with the group, with this group essentially comprising of the 2 people on the outs, along with 2 of the more influential players there, with Gary's pitch here being to have the 4 strongest players get to the end, with them obviously pushing for Jamie to be the first to go, which obviously doesn't really go anywhere, where both Steph and Judd come out of this talking about not going through with the deal, with Gary still also thinking he needs immunities. Again, this was all really pointless. But ultimately we see them return to camp with coffee, because it's sponsored, with Cindy being so excited, saying Folger singles are the most perfect thing to come back to camp with, I guess. And then proceed to see Judd and Jamie talking, with Judd reassuring him, saying that nothing's changed, and there wasn't a peep about strategy, and he wouldn't lie to you, which is technically a lie. I do question, why not just tell him the truth? I think Jamie will assume that there was some strategy talk. So again, I think by you lying about there being no strategy talk just makes it actually seem even worse. But either way, we get to the immunity challenge, with it being what is now a pretty classic challenge of the rope untangling challenge, where you're connected to a rope around some obstacles and you have to get through. Weirdly being the first appearance of this challenge, which I'm kind of surprised it ended up debuting until here. But here, the first 4 to finish end up moving on to the final round, with Gary barely missing out here, with Cindy, Steph, Jamie, and Rafe moving on to the final round, which ends up being a 3-level tower, with Cindy actually being in the lead for most of it, despite being the last to qualify, to where she ultimately gets stuck at the end, with Rafe ending up pulling out the win, his second immunity win, and winning actually a surprising 2 immunities out of the 3 he's competed in at this point, which is again impressive considering you would not really expect that, Rafe. But following this, we do see Jamie again being worried, asking Judd if they're good and solid, only for Judd to say that we're voting for Gary and that Jamie's not going anywhere, and he might get 1 vote from Gary, and that's it. Though, interestingly, we do see Jamie being worried about Stephanie in particular here, and proceeding to confront Rafe, because Rafe is Stephanie's lapdog to them, which, again, not the greatest read. But again, we see them playing Moncala once again, with him asking Rafe if he's going to stick to the 6, only for Rafe to say, I'm not voting for you tonight, but if you ask me again, I might. Which, again, should have been a very sketchy response, all for Jamie to weirdly respond by saying, I'm going to kill you. I'm just going to murder you. I mean, seriously, I'm just gonna murder you, which is a very creepy thing to say. Now, again, I assume he was joking, but still, why would you say this? Again, completely comes off as unhinged. And we do proceed to see Rafe going to Lydia, telling her that Jamie's driving him insane, to where, despite the fact that Lydia talks about being close to Jamie since day 1, and she doesn't want to vote him out, she ends up just doing what Rafe and Steph say, with Rafe then telling Steph about wanting to vote out Jamie, which she agrees, to where, again, clearly the vote ends up shifting onto Jamie here in a spot where I don't actually think this is the correct move for Steph in particular, where, again, Jamie's one of the only people that I think she has at least a semblance of a chance of beating at the end. Also, again, probably not a great move for Lydia, who has a relationship with Jamie. I think it's a pretty marginal move for Rafe in the sense that he's kind of already sunk his position with Jamie, where Jamie clearly doesn't trust him, though ultimately I think Rafe probably has more options outside of Jamie, to where, again, I can kind of take it or leave it from Rafe's point of view. Though, interestingly, the person that I think benefits the most from this move is actually Cindy, which is funny considering Cindy ends up voting Jamie out here, yet none of that's actually focused on the show. We don't actually even see them approach Cindy to get on board with this vote, despite the fact that, again, this is definitely the best for Cindy in this group. Again, Cindy is someone that theoretically should have been at the bottom of the power structure coming into the merge. And again, by taking out Jamie here, she clearly leapfrogs him and can further solidify her bond with Judd from them being on the original OG tribe. And again, I think this clearly benefits Cindy the most, despite the fact that we don't really see her getting on board with this vote outside of just her talking about being creeped out by Jamie, to where, interestingly, Judd is the only person not involved in this vote, though, to be fair, kind of makes sense considering Jamie and Judd seem to be working in lockstep and both seemingly trying to actively get each other to the end. But ultimately, again, we get the tribal where We do get some humorous content here from Judd talking up how great of a person Gary is. Again, thinking Gary's about to go in the jury, talking about how he's a man's man, and this is a difficult vote, which funnily won't be his same opinion the next time around. But anyway, we get to the vote with no immunity idol back in play, which is actually kind of interesting that they didn't replant the hidden immunity idol, where maybe they just didn't think of that at this point, considering we technically don't see it idol be re-hidden for a few more seasons, though considering how early on it was played here, you would think that they would want to reintroduce it into the game, but again, they don't, and it ends up being a pretty obvious 6-2 Jamie vote here, with Jamie having a pretty notable exit on the way out, saying, "Blindsided, nice! Now that's how you vote somebody out," as he leaves, a quote that somehow gets misquoted every single time it's brought up on the show after this, but again, a pretty notable exit from him. Although we see Jeff funnily saying that he just gave you the best advice, consider it a gift, with this being kind of the first time that Jeff really hypes up the concept of blindsiding. We see Jamie being kind of indignant on his way out, being upset at Lydia, saying it hurts when good people go bad, which is funny considering it's not like he was actually planning on taking Lydia to the end anyway. But either way, we lose Jamie, and Jamie, again, incredible character on this season, kind of understated character in Survivor history. Once again, kind of someone that just comes off very unhinged by the end. Too fair, it got to a scary level, especially again his comments to Rafe there at the end were definitely a bit sketchy, though. I think Jamie is someone that, again, brought some fun to the show, got into a lot of drama, had some funny quirks about him that just makes him a fun character. While, again, it's not someone that I ever need to see play again. I know he, again, supposedly was in the running for Blood vs. Water, as everybody was. I do think he was a great one-time character on the show here. Definitely played his role pretty well, especially with his rivalry with Bobby John. Ends up having this great downfall of his own alliance turning on him. Ultimately, again, I do think Jamie definitely brings a lot to the show here, despite him, again, being another one that isn't a particularly remembered player in Survivor history. And over episode 11, which takes us back to the begonging that you would expect from this season, we did get some intrigue from the offset with Judd, obviously having been blindsided by the previous vote, being upset that no one told him, with Judd saying his alliance went berserk, and here comes the backstabbing and lying, only from the just actually be upset at Gary, which is very weird. Again, you would think that this would be kind of a wake-up call to him, that maybe his alliance isn't as close to him as you would expect, but instead he actually kind of doubles down, and instead the following morning ends up being obsessed with taking out Gary, where we do start to see Gary do some decent legwork in the morning. Him talking to Lydia, with Lydia clearly knowing she's on the bottom of her alliance at this point, and him trying to pull her in, with his plan now being to pull in her and Cindy for him and Danny to pull over this major flip in the game, which surely will happen. Though, to be fair, again, we do see him actually getting Lydia on board, though the worry here is Cindy, where again, Cindy was never going to do this. And so while we see Judd watching them talking, saying that Gary's working on Lydia, and that he's lying because he wanted Lydia and Cindy out during the reward, but now wants to work with him, which, I mean, as we'll get to later in the episode, isn't really lying. Again, people can change their minds. Now, again, I guess he'll be lying if he was still intending on taking out Lydia and Cindy, but again, clearly he wouldn't be. But at this point, where we do finally get to see the Rafe-Steph relationship on the show, which is very weird. That doesn't really get properly introduced until this late into the season. Again, a relationship that is so integral to how this season plays out. And even here, it's mentioned under the context of them working alongside Judd and Cindy, with this being a 4-person alliance that, again, will surely stick. But obviously it kind of explains where Judd and Cindy are in the game, why Judd isn't really freaking out after the Jamie blindside, why Cindy hasn't turned on Nakum up to this point, because again, they have this alliance. Though I do find it funny how they keep on talking here about how Gary can't win immunity, when it's like, doesn't really matter. Again, you have 3 people you can vote out. Man, Gary's likely not going to win them all. I mean, to be fair, though, again, they obviously just watched Survivor Palau, and again, Tom clearly just did that. And again, maybe this is a reaction to that, but ultimately, again, you would expect him to lose something eventually, especially since he hasn't even been particularly dominant in challenges. He only won 1 immunity challenge up to this point, so it's not like he's this massive challenge beast. But either way, we do get to a reward challenge, being the return of the Coconut Chop Challenge, with questions about Mayan culture, where the winner gets a trip to a spa with mojitos and skewered meat, which feels random. Anyway, we do get some intrigue here from Lydia taking out Steph first, with Steph being upset, saying jealousy gets you nowhere. Lydia talks about how she hasn't eaten while Steph has already eaten 3 times. Which, again, I think is fair, but obviously, again, maybe not the greatest gameplay, though at the same time, again, at this point, Lydia did seem to be on the outs anyway. Though, again, clearly most people would have gone for Gary first here, where Gary's obviously out next. with him and Cindy end up going after each other, which is obviously a great sign for Gary's plan to be working with Cindy. But ultimately ends up coming down to Cindy versus Rafe, with Cindy pulling out the win, with her taking Rafe with her anyway, to where the reward itself here ends up being pretty boring, though we do end up seeing Cindy and Rafe bonding, though again, that doesn't really lead to anything. But once they return, we do see them really talking down the reward, and I find it funny how the edit portrays this as if they're lying when, again, it actually did seem like not a great reward. But again, we do cut to Lydia talking about how she had to listen to them talk about how good the food is, which is like not what they were saying. But anyway, she says she felt insulted and that Cindy should have picked her for whatever reason. Oh, we have like Lydia eating fish soup and Cindy getting annoyed at her for acting like she's dying, scrounging for whatever she can eat. With, again, this further emphasizing just how much on the bottom Lydia is. Though also just, again, kind of being this weird content here of showing like Lydia playing the victim. Oh, well, we cut to Steph talking about how annoyed she is at Lydia and that she's lucky she's still in the game. That Steph is eaten because she puts her ass on the line for those rewards. Only for this to cut to negative content for Steph, with Gary talking about how she hasn't even lost any weight, and Lydia saying that everyone puts Steph on a pedestal and no one does anything about it. Which, I mean, to be fair, you were one of those people. But also, it's like, do you need to do anything about it? Again, get to the end of Steph, you're probably going to win anyway. Either way, we got to the immunity challenge, it being the return of the challenge where they're told about a folklore and they have to run the stations, answer questions about it. The challenge ends up being pretty close here between Rafe and Gary, though Rafe ends up pulling out the win here. Where at this point, I mean, obviously Gary's going home, but we do end up getting some pretty good content here from Rafe, him talking about who would have guessed the gay Mormon would win the most immunities, having, again, now won 3 out of 4, and talking about having never seen someone like him do so well in competitions like this, which, again, nice representation for this era of Survivor, obviously something that would be more prevalent in the modern day. But as for the actual vote, we do see Lydia and Danny talking, with this kind of being the start of their bond, of them being like the underdogs in the game, with Lydia, for some reason, thinking that she's the first to go, and that for some reason they'll vote her out before Gary and Danny, which I could not tell you why she thinks that. Oh, well, Steph talks about her 4-person alliance being perfect and they have such trust in each other. We're getting clearly nothing is going to disrupt that. Though again, continues to be a negative look for her, where she says, weirdly last time she felt powerless and this time she's too powerful. Well, they're just coming off very cocky here. Oh, well, we then cut to Gary and Danny talking about how she's running the game, with now the plan being to pull in Rafe and Lydia because they clearly realize that Cindy isn't going with them. With, I love Gary saying here that Cindy doesn't like him, so he doesn't care what happens to her. But this is kind of weird, as again, the plan here seems to be to pull in Rafe, though we do see Gary here actually campaigning to Rafe and Steph together, talking about how tight they were at the beginning, and Rafe saying he wants to go with people he trusts, and he doesn't trust Judd. Again, that's the main dilemma here leading into the vote, though again, it always felt pretty clear that Gary was going home, though we do have an interesting moment here on Gary's way out, in that he does tell Rafe that Danny is strong and trustworthy, which does seem like a major reason why Rafe ends up trusting Danny in the following round, seemingly pretty integral to Danny's winning trajectory here. But ultimately, again, there's not really much suspense coming into Tribal, though we do see Judd talking about Gary's running around like a lunatic, and he doesn't know if it worked or not. Well, clearly it didn't work, but it does lead to a lot of tension at Tribal between Gary and Judd, though actually first we do get some tension here between Steph and Lydia, with Steph still being annoyed at Lydia for taking her out of the reward, with Lydia saying that everyone looks up to Steph and that she's played before, but she's running the show. Only for Steph to be upset, saying that if you have something to say it to my face. When it's like, and she kind of just did. But at least this moment of Gary saying that he likes Steph, but some people are starstruck by her, and that if they want an autograph, they can get it after the show. To which we cut to the jury laughing, with Bobby, John, and Jamie being very chummy on the jury, which is a very funny payoff to their dynamic. But again, this leads into the content from Judd, with him talking about his moral compass and saying that he hasn't lied yet, but he has to start lying. But he's a bad liar, leading into him calling out Gary for being a liar because he said that Cindy and Lydia shouldn't be here, but now he wants to work with them, which, again, a lie. And Gary responds with that. Though I'll be honest, I don't love how Gary responds to this either, being kind of aghast at the fact that anyone would call out him for having potentially lied, saying that isn't a lie, that's playing the game. And again, at least this dumb fight over like what a lie is. But it finally does lead to Gary calling out Judd for lying about the idol clues, saying that the idol was on the ground when in reality it was in a tree, only for Jeff to say, Judd, you got caught. Judd to say, told you I'm a bad liar, man. But again, this being a humorous sequence here, and does further sink Judd's reputation in the game here. Obviously, again, being propped up more as a liar and untrustworthy to the likes of Rafe and Steph. But again, at the same time, it was still pretty clear where this vote was going, where we get to the vote itself, where Judd ends up voting for Gary here, saying that you run around like a squirrel trying to get a nut. And do me a favor, get the hell out of here, which is a fun confessional. But ultimately, again, Gary's vote out 6-1 with a kind of funny final words here, talking about how his tribe still doesn't know his real name, with it still paying off that dynamic, which also very weird if that is the case. The fact that Danny, again, knew that he was a football player but didn't actually know his real name. Because again, despite the fact that Danny calls him out for being a football player, she never does specifically say he's Gary Hogaboom. Either way, without we lose Gary. And I think Gary's a very understated character on this season. I think he's one that, again, obviously gets remembered for the Gary Hawkins of it all, but really outside that, I think Gary actually is a really interesting player here. He's actually someone that I would have liked to see play again, where again, he kind of was a scrappy underdog towards the end of the season here, and definitely has a lot of like Tom Westman sort of qualities to him from the offset, to where I do think he comes out of this being one of the better players on the season, just given kind of a raw deal. But also with that, again, I just thought he was a fun player to watch, and I do think he's someone that kind of gets lost in the shuffle over time, to where obviously at this point it's pretty impractical to think of him as a potential returnee in the modern day, though he is someone that I always did find to be a really interesting presence on this season, someone that I would have ideally liked to see play again, though at this point it's not happening. Now for episode 12, probably the most notable episode of the season, possibly the best episode of the season, and also probably the episode that starts Danny's winning storyline despite it being towards the end of the season. But again, this ends up being a massive episode for Danny here. It's starting off with her talking about being the next on the totem pole and ready to have her head chopped off, where everyone else is just playing scared, which is a typical underdog thing to say. It says that she's not going out without a fight, to where we do see her having Lydia alongside her, but they need one more person to do something, saying that the Alliance has to break up and they can't all go to the Final Five, which I question, why can't they all go to the Final Five? They literally can. Like, why can't they? Either way, we got to the auction, a very notable auction here. The one that actually does start off fairly tame, with just Danny getting beef jerky for $20, where no one bets against her. We also get Cindy winning milk and cookies. We got Lydia winning a mosquito net, with Jeff proceeding to call out how many bug bites she has on her back. Always see Rafe and Danny win a cheesesteak and fries together. But really the big thing that matters here is the item that ends up being an advantage at the immunity challenge, which ends up actually being the first time Survivor does this, of having an actual game advantage at the auction, which kind of surprising it took this long for them to include these into the auction. They'll also end up kind of being what ends up breaking the auction. Obviously, in the modern day, most players are going to hold out for game advantages, with them obviously looking at the game as more important than food. Where eventually it does end up kind of lessening the bidding aspect of the auction in seasons down the road. But again, when it appears here, it's a bit more unique. And we do shockingly see Danny bidding 200 here and just winning, where I do question if Danny's actually on the bottom, people are actually targeting Danny, why didn't anyone bid against her? Or again, based on what we were shown, at least they had enough money to do so. And kind of insane that the first ever time that advantage was given in an immunity challenge like this ends up being such an integral piece to the winning player's story. But anyway, the final item for this auction ends up coming around the corner, it being their loved ones, which is a bit of a weird way to do the loved ones visit on this season, where they have to bid for their loved ones to have an overnight stay, which is again just kind of weird to literally be bidding on people here. But here we see Steph and Judd be the main two to be bidding here, with them being able to pull money from others, with Lydia giving her money to Steph for some reason, while Cindy gives her money to Judd, with Judd ending up having more by the end, winning his wife Kristen and allowing her to come back to camp, to where we get the reveal now that Judd also gets to pick two other loved ones to come back as well. I can't believe it. Which obviously he has to pick Cindy here as the one that gave him money, whose loved one here is her twin sister Mindy of Rock of Love fame, which is funny, which I believe ended up filming a few years after this. And I believe she was a notable character on that season, like went on other shows following that. To where kind of funny that this is seemingly Mindy Hall's first TV appearance here. Oh, for his other pick, Judd ends up picking Steph and her boyfriend, because Steph gets almost every reward. Those with loved ones here get to stay at the merch camp, all while those not picked end up having to be relegated to the old Yaksha camp for whatever reason. I still don't understand why they do this. They did this obviously in Pro Islands, and it just becomes kind of a trope of those that don't get their loved ones get exiled. Though considering they later allow them to return to camp before the loved ones even leave anyway. It just makes you question, like, why did they do this? But to be fair, this ends up being, again, kind of integral to how this game plays out, though, because the group that ends up being relegated to the old Liuksha ends up essentially being the two outsiders in Danny and Lydia alongside Rafe, with this seemingly further putting him against Judd here, obviously giving him time to spend with Danny and Lydia and giving him just more ammo to utilize against Judd, where it seemed to really be the point where Rafe and Danny's bond just truly solidifies, obviously again with help of Gary's final words to Rafe that he should trust Danny, which really allows them to solidify this relationship, and we see them agree to attempt to get Judd out, with Rafe saying he needs to turn Steph against Judd, because and to do so, they need to catch Judd in a lie, which technically you kind of already caught Judd in a lie. But either way, back at camp, we do see Judd getting some pretty good content here, making fire on his own with his wife being shocked, and him talking about how his wife thought that was pretty hot and that he's a sexy camper. All Steph says that this is a dream come true and that she owes Judd big time, and boy will she pay him back. But we do see Judd telling his wife about how tight of an alliance him and Steph have, and that his plan is to go to the end with her, to which he would beat her, which, to be fair, he is playing optimally at least, so at least that's something. But this is where we do see Kristen and Steph having a conversation, with Steph saying that hopefully it works out and that Jersey would be proud. Later gets propped up as Steph lying to Kristen here, where, again, maybe there was more that we obviously didn't see, but based on what we did see here, again, it's like propped up as if like Steph lied to Kristen that she was taking Judd to the final two, and it's like she literally even says here, like, hopefully it works out. It's like, it doesn't even seem like she's super confident in this moment, but either way, we do get talk here about how Danny's the next to go, though there is worry about Danny's advantage, but talk about how she's not a threat, and the only thing she's good at is shooting basketballs, where it does feel like Danny was really underestimated at this point in the game, where I know supposedly that was because Danny was very sick by this point in the season, and obviously was not performing particularly well in challenges, where it made Steph and Ray feel better about taking her deeper into the game, thinking she's unlikely to win future challenges. That obviously ends up kind of backfiring on her, where it does feel like Danny kind of having this similar perception to how Jenna was perceived in the Amazon, where a lot of the reason why she was kind of kept around towards the end game was because she was looked at as someone that was sick and tried to quit, to where they kept her around because they didn't think she would win challenges. And again, it feels like Danny's kind of in a similar mold here. Anyway, after other tribe members return to camp and we see the family leave, we do get Lydia and Danny talking to Judd, and what ends up being a pretty important conversation, with Lydia asking Judd if he has a game plan, with Judd saying that he knows who the threats are, says, look what happened to Jamie, with this conversation obviously being later utilized to turn Steph against Judd. And again, it is still obviously him throwing Steph under the bus, considering, again, obviously Steph voted out Jamie. So I do think obviously Danny and Lydia very much propped this up as being a bit more malicious than what it really was. I don't think Judd was ever truly considering turning against Ray for Steph at this point in the game. Though obviously, again, they end up using this to their benefit. But either way, we get to the immunity challenge. Again, a pretty notable one here, it being the return of that like chess-like board game challenge where you flip a tile every time you step on one, and last person that can move on the board ends up winning. Though this ends up being a more complex version of the original formula, with there being like multiple levels and a top platform that spins, though none of this really matters because Danny has her advantage, which was revealed to be her being able to switch with any one time at any point in the game, which is essentially an auto win if you use it at the correct time, as you could obviously just wait until everyone's cornered and swap with the person with the biggest territory. And again, it's just essentially an auto win, as long as you're not an idiot, I guess, where I guess technically you could mess it up. But either way, Danny ends up not doing that here, pulls out the win, which really gets propped up as this $1 million challenge win for her. And again, it's this big story that they like to talk about later in the season, though to be fair, I don't know if that's actually true. It does seem like Judd was probably going to go whether or not Danny won immunity, where it felt like Rafe at least was very gung-ho about wanting Danny at 3 at this point. And again, it didn't feel like Steph was really going to fight against that no matter what, to where I don't think that this actually was a $1 million challenge win. I think she likely would have survived either way, but obviously it makes for a good story here. But again, it's following this that we do see Danny putting in some pretty good work here with Steph, telling her about the conversation with Judd and that he's still upset over the Jamie situation, with Steph saying that she'd like to believe Judd, but he's already been caught in lies while Danny hasn't lied at all, which ultimately, why does that really matter that much? But again, whether or not Judd is a liar or not, at this point in the game, that doesn't really matter if you have Danny or Lydia on board anyway, which you seem to do over Judd and Cindy, to where if you're solidifying your relationship with Rafe and you would have Danny's loyalty at 5, it's not like you're in desperate need of taking out Judd at 6 here, but whatever. This does lead to a Rafe-Steph conversation where they talk about how Judd's pulling a Jamie, with surprisingly Steph saying here first that we need to get rid of Judd. And Rafe ended up agreeing to that, which is something that I actually did not remember correctly. Whenever I thought of this before rewatching the season here, I always remembered it as if Rafe convinced Stephanie to take out Judd when, again, based on the show, obviously, it doesn't seem like that's the case. It feels like it's more so Steph kind of came to this on her own after being told that information from Danny, which is probably worse for Steph, as again, this is just such a bad move for Steph. And to be fair, probably minorly lessens my opinion of Rafe. But again, despite the fact that we see Steph come to this conclusion on her own, we do also see her being worried about having obviously promised Judd's wife that they would go towards the end, only to turn on him right away, which is, again, probably more of the reason why I remember this as if she was manipulated in doing this, but fully does add to why you shouldn't do this for Steph. Obviously, this is just, again, further burning a jury vote that she should have had in her corner. Again, she was one of the closest people to Judd, and for her to now blindside Judd and get Judd legitimately against her is, again, not a great spot to be in. But again, we see them going through this plan, with them telling Danny that their plans to take out Judd, and then for some reason, Lydia next at 5, which I do question why. Like, why are you going to 4, Cindy? Again, we see them get Lydia on board the Judd vote as well, to where we do see them question, should we pull in Cindy? Which they ultimately don't do, which I don't fully get why. Now, obviously, again, Judd and Cindy did come from original Nakum and wasn't really involved in a lot of what was going on here and just flipping on Judd, though ultimately, if you're planning on going to 4 of Cindy, like, why not tell Cindy here? It's like, what can Judd really do? Even if she tells Judd, which I don't even think she would have done anyway, to where, again, I don't really think this was the right call, but this is all we see Judd talking about how Lydia's time to go, and he would miss her, but as long as it's not him, he'll have a smile on his face, which is obviously some famous last words there, as we do get the tribal, which is actually fairly boring, which is kind of underwhelming considering it's Judd's final tribal here, obviously one of the most prolific characters at Tribal Council in the show's history, but ultimately we do have Judd voting for Lydia here, saying, you sang and danced your way around the jungle. Adios. It ultimately ends up being a 4-2 Judd vote, with Judd obviously being pissed as he leaves, leading to a notable exit here. Thanks, guys. Hope you all get bit by a freaking crocodile. Scumbags. Which at least he gets a final fun moment here on his way out. Though, something that has always bothered me about this is how immediately after his torch gets snuffed, then he starts walking down the path at the end. We have him saying scumbags again, which clearly wasn't real. It was clearly just them replaying the same scumbags from earlier, which I question, why did they do this? Like, maybe he did say scumbags and the audio was just bad, so he just replayed the previous scumbags. Well, otherwise, this just makes no sense why they just, like, randomly put him saying scumbags here. Like, it's something that's always bothered me about how, like, blatant this is, that it's literally just the same scumbags played again. Either way, we get some funny final words here from Judd, saying that he was pissed off and pissed on, and that he didn't lie to anyone, man. And surely Judd never lied. Also, again, Judd ends up being an incredible character on this season, by far the best character on this season, a really insane character on this season. I still think his tribal during the Margaret boot is still one of the greatest character moments in the history of the show. It is such incredible TV. It's such a funny moment, literally a scene out of a sitcom, where I feel like that really is how Judd feels on this season. He feels like literally a character out of a sitcom. Someone that is so real and raw on the show, yet despite that comes off so humorous. Also being someone that, it's not even like he didn't have any game to him. Like, Judd was definitely someone that was playing the game pretty hard. And again, he obviously talks a lot about how he doesn't lie, but again, he did lie. He did play the game, and I do think Judd was just a really interesting character on this season. Someone that, again, I'm disappointed that we never got to see play again. And to be fair, I don't know if it would necessarily go well for him if he were to play again. It would probably just be a lesser version of his original appearance. And I don't know how it would necessarily go for him gameplay-wise either, where I don't see him really gelling with a lot of returnee casts. Yeah, he's someone that, again, would be fun to see back, though obviously I know that production supposedly did not particularly like him, and that he was a bit hard to deal with. I know Jeff has talked about his annoyances with him at points, and ultimately I don't believe he's really been that deep into consideration for any returnee season. Even though I know supposedly he's gotten calls here and there, but again, it's just a spot where it's a shame that we never see Judd play again, as again, he's such an incredible character on this season, though from what we did get out of him on this season, he ends up being one of the best one-time characters in the history of the show. But number episode 13, the penultimate episode of the season, that ends up being, again, another pretty solid one that does largely revolve around a certain player and the card they end up winning. But anyway, we started off with obviously the reaction to the Judd vote, with Stephanie being upset that she was called a scumbag, said that Judd turned into Jamie. And just like Jamie, she probably shouldn't have voted out Judd either. With again, that probably being one of the only people that Steph could have had a semblance of a chance in a jury vote against, though, or vote to her even then. I think she probably loses against Judd anyway. This ends up leading to content around Cindy, with her being upset that no one told her about the Judd vote, with her obviously being nervous that that's what happened to Judd during the Jamie vote, and she sees this pattern and makes her uncomfortable, where, again, it did seem like actually at this point that Cindy was not the intended target for the following round. It did seem like Lydia was for whatever reason. Ultimately, that ends up being kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. But this is also where we get content around how Rafe is the last guy standing, with Lydia proceeding to say that he's one of the girls, which, again, probably shouldn't say. But this does lead to this weird segment about how Rafe says that all the cool kids have left and now they can finally be dorkier and be fun, with us seeing them all try to be cross-eyed and talk about how hot Justin Timberlake is and sing I Want It That Way by the Backstreet Boys and things that are dorky and fun. But eventually they end up getting tree mail. Alongside it is a car key. So I wonder what the reward's going to be. With Steph talking about being in desperate need of a car, while Lydia ends up saying that she hasn't won anything and would love to win this for her son, which I'll say is very tragic, knowing the backstory around this, the fact that Lydia's son sadly ended up passing away not too long after the season ended up airing, even more tragically in a car accident of all things. Where again, her confessional here ends up being kind of tragic in retrospect, but ultimately we do get the reward challenge, it being the return of the second chance challenge, again a staple for the car challenges here, with them playing for a 2006 Pontiac Torrent, along with a trip to an archaeologist camp and steak for whatever reason. Anyway, round one has them having to redo the balance beam challenge that has Danny, Cindy, and Steph moving on, with round two having to break tiles with clubs that has Steph and Cindy moving on, where the final round ends up being a calendar puzzle that Cindy wins. And what a win it'll be for Cindy, where again, I really wonder if she'll like the car that she gets. This is where we do cut to Jeff mentioning that the person that has won the car has never won the game. And weirdly being this fairly meta moment in Survivor, again, a point where it did feel like they tried to make as little references to previous seasons as possible. So again, this being a point where they're directly referring to the car curse is pretty interesting here. It's obviously utilized as a way to set up this future dilemma, with Jeff saying that you can get rid of the curse and give up your car so that the other three players can get a car, which we then proceed to see three other cars be driven in, which is kind of insane. And ultimately, this is a decision that, again, should be fairly easy. And again, this is a typical type of dilemma that ends up happening a lot in future seasons. Mind you, not the car, usually again with like family visits or something to that nature, where again, you give up your own reward to give it to more people. And there's a spot here where Cindy clearly doesn't want to give up the car, saying that she doesn't believe in superstitions and believes in making the impossible possible, and thinks that she can win the car and $1 million too, so she ends up keeping the car, which I will say for most people should be a fairly obvious decision, and to be fair, probably ends up being the right one for Cindy, to where, or from what I understand, she still has a car to this day. It kind of worked out for her in that sense at least, but ultimately again, it is obviously a selfish decision to keep the car. Yeah, I just feel like it's a fairly obvious one to make, and it is funny that we instantly see Steph agree, saying she would have kept the car too, because if anything Steph is, it's sympathetic towards selfishness. Though it is an opinion that isn't exactly supported by the rest of the cast, which we'll get to. But first, again, we'll talk about the reward, where Steph ends up being picked to go alongside Cindy, where they have to weirdly cook their own food, which I found strange, but either way, they end up meeting archaeologists and who tells them about Mayan culture, and you can clearly tell how uninterested they were in it, with Cindy just talking about how excited she is to see her car in the corner of her eye, saying her mind is reeling and she's never been this happy in her whole life as she won a new car, and she definitely won't be mentioning this new car over and over again, and that no one has ever had the chance to give other people cars except for Oprah, and that there wouldn't be a guarantee to win just because you gave away the car. So she doesn't think people will be bitter about it, about that. Though again, I ultimately think Cindy does have the right state of mind here. Again, the car curse is obviously just superstition. It's not really a real thing. And even though the show will prop it up as her taking the car is what did lead to her elimination, I do feel like there were other reasons for it as well, where ultimately, again, I think taking the car and guaranteeing that you at least come out of the game with that is, again, still the right call to be making here. But again, this is when we cut back to camp with Rafe being shocked at the decision that Cindy ended up making, saying that he never would have kept the car for himself and would have always given it to the other people and felt like there was no other choice there, with Danny agreeing with this logic. Oh, well, Lydia says that she would have kept it too. But again, Rafe ends up saying here that if she gave away the cars, he wouldn't be able to vote her out, but now he doesn't know what's going to happen. AKA, he's clearly wanting her out. Despite the fact that, again, I think he should have been wanting her out anyway. And I do think ultimately we end up hearing him say other logic for her vote off, the idea that she's better at challenges and is a bigger threat at the end, where ultimately, again, I do think that played more of a factor here than the base concept of her not giving up the car. And I do think Rafe comes off in a bit of a high horse over this. Now, again, Rafe does come off as a seemingly kind-hearted guy throughout this season, definitely someone that is very empathetic and cares about other people to the detriment of himself, to where, again, do I believe that he would give up the car? Probably, yeah. I do think he probably would have. Though I do think him feeling that everyone should be acting the way that he does, and also him demonizing Cindy for not doing that, I do think isn't that ideal here. So it obviously does play an impact on the game here. And to be fair, it's not like Cindy does herself any favors, where Cindy returns to camp and constantly talks about how nice her car is, talking about how nice it is to drive and how nice the suspension is and how it's a luxury vehicle. Talks about how she's never owned a new car and asks people if they like her car, where again, she constantly talks about her car, where Rafe ends up getting annoyed at all this, only for us to cut the confessional from Cindy of her saying how excited everyone else was to hear about her car, when it's like, again, that's definitely some lack of self-awareness there. But following this, we do see Cindy wanting to target Danny in this position, saying that it would suck if she went farther than them when they could have gotten rid of her, but they didn't, saying that Danny is the biggest threat, to where I wonder what that is leading up to. Oh, we see Steph and Rafe debrief, with Rafe telling her how shocked he was that Cindy took the car, only for Steph to respond with why, and that she can't believe it, saying that Rafe plays the martyr and this is the first time they've disagreed on anything this entire game, saying that Rafe plays too nicely and should be playing harder than what he is, when it's like, realistically for Rafe, getting rid of Cindy is not actually a bad call. Now again, his justification for it is not ideal, but ultimately, again, keeping around Danny over Cindy is definitely something that does benefit Rafe, especially in comparison to Steph. Either way, we do get to the immunity challenge, with Cindy once again talking about how great the reward is and how the car was in the corner of her eye the entire time and how awesome it is that it's hers. But it ends up being another weird challenge here of you having to unspool yourself from a pole, which was, again, just kind of a boring challenge. But Steph easily wins here, with her finally winning something, her first individual immunity win and her only one. But it's following this that we do see Rafe re-solidifying his alliance with Danny, saying that he won't vote for her and promises to take her to the final three alongside Steph, saying that he'll get Steph to switch her vote, with Danny proceeding to promise him back that she'll take him to final two, which interestingly Rafe never promises back. Obviously, again, Rafe never promised Danny final two, only final three, though it is Danny's promise to him of a final two that really ends up solidifying this as Rafe's final three plans, where obviously in his mind, if he gets the final three, he's guaranteed to make it to the end. And that kind of ends up being his logic for the rest of the game, the reason why he's trying for that final three. However, obviously, I think that's a very flawed strategy, especially based around the concept that I think he loses to Danny, and he should have known that he loses to Danny. Where, again, he does talk about this after the fact as if he thinks he has a shot against her, which again is the incorrect read, but I think that ends up leading to what is so faulty about this logic to begin with. But I do think Rafe very much underestimated Danny's winner prospects here, and I think thought he had more of a chance against Danny than what he really did. But anyway, we do see Rafe proceeding to put in some work here with Steph, where, again, this is probably more in line of what I think I remembered Rafe doing to take out Judd, though really this is the point where we do see Rafe pushing Steph a bit more here and taking out Cindy in a spot where she really doesn't want to do so, telling her that they can beat Danny more than Cindy and that Cindy is a fiercer competitor. Though Steph says that she feels bad as she's already turned on Judd, and now she turns on Cindy, she won't be getting Jamie, Judd, or Cindy's votes, which, I mean, to be fair, you probably wouldn't be getting them anyway. But also Cindy just took her on reward, and obviously, again, this would be a terrible look for Steph. And this is a terrible move for Steph to get rid of Cindy, someone that is more loyal to than Danny. And again, this is a point where I do fully think that it is Rafe getting Steph to do something completely against their best interest in a spot where she even knows that. Now, to be fair, Steph was, again, going to lose anyway, and also Steph didn't really have much agency to really do much in this spot anyway, where despite the fact that, again, it's talk about how Steph is this very dominant player, she's really in the spot here at the final five, where she has very little agency in what happens here. She can really just tag along with the Cindy vote or just be on the outs, where, again, Rafe seemingly had Danny on lock and Lydia on lock, to where, again, it felt like those three votes were always going for Cindy here, and again, didn't really feel like Steph had that much she could truly do, and again, she could have like really pushed Lydia and tried to get her to turn on Danny, but I don't think that would have happened here, to where ultimately, again, this was a losing battle for Steph, but it really does show the lack of power she truly has in this endgame stretch here. Interestingly, we do actually see Steph warning Cindy that Rafe is after her, which I do actually very much question what her intentions are here, where obviously this is a spot where Steph seemingly is loyal to Rafe and does want to take Rafe to the end of the game, To which I do question, why is she warning Cindy then? Like, I guess to potentially, like, save her jury prospects, but it's still a spot here where I think it's very precarious in that this could definitely blow up your relationship with Rafe, piss off Rafe, the fact that you're throwing him under the bus and potentially turn him against you, especially now that he has someone like Danny by his side that is more loyal to him. And to be fair, again, this is a spot where everyone knows Steph is a massive GOAT, and maybe she thought that perception would follow around her anyway, and people would still take her to the end despite that. But it's still a spot where I do question the logic here. Where at this point, Cindy obviously leads a campaign here against Rafe, trying to get Danny on board and trying to make an all-girl Final Four happen. Again, what could have been the first ever Black Widow Brigade of Lydia, Cindy, Danny, and Steph, which really would have been them just stumbling their way into an all-women Final Four. But either way, we get the tribal where, again, there's still more talk about the car curse, with Cindy saying it's silly and it has nothing to do with the car. I'll get Lydia voting, saying that she's just voting with the tribe, because that's kind of Lydia for you. Which, I mean, to be fair, if that is her logic, like, maybe there was a chance that Steph could have gotten her vote. But anyway, we have Rafe voting for Cindy, saying that you just vote wherever the wind blows, I guess. I don't know where that really came from, because it's not like Cindy has really shown herself to be someone that would vote people out of the blue. But either way, it ends up being a 4-1 Cindy vote, with her leaving with a final comment as well, saying, I'll be thinking about you guys when looking at the stars through sunroof of my new car, because we clearly need another reference to her new car. To which I do love how we cut to Judd fist bumping as she says this, which is, again, just kind of weird. But with that, we lose Cindy, and Cindy is one of the more under-edited characters of this season. Yet, despite that, definitely had some fun moments, especially towards the end here, where despite of her coming off fairly unnotable early on, outside for content around her being a zookeeper, it did feel like by the end here, her final episode ends up being a pretty funny one for her, with her having this funny obsession with her new car that ends up being bled into her downfall. That ends up being, again, a fun trajectory for her, where really outside that, again, one of the more subdued characters of the season, though, so that at least had that pop at the end to make her a somewhat notable character. But now moving on to the finale, a just kind of average finale in the grand scheme of things, one that doesn't really have any particularly iconic moments in it, but one that doesn't feel boring throughout it, and definitely has some decent enough character stuff. But again, we start off with the Final Four round, where Lydia talks about feeling like the odd man out, and that it's always been her destiny, where, again, clearly set up to go home at this point, especially in a spot where Lydia's edit was, again, very lacking on this season. She was barely even on the show for a good chunk of the season. Through that, it became pretty clear Lydia was not meant to be someone that we're meant to be caring too much, to where, again, her being the first out in the finale kind of made a lot of sense. But following that, we then get content around Danny, with her saying that she's a Kansas Jayhawks fan, and that the last 4 years they've gotten to the Final Four twice, and feels that she has pressure on her now to bring that championship home, because, again, sports are most of Danny's identity. Though obviously, again, also felt like kind of a winner quote there. But, and we do get them getting tree mail, which leads to a pretty funny moment of Lydia saying that this is good, coming back very excited, and proceeds to read it to the rest of the tribe, with it revealing that they're getting Mayan visitors for a ritual. And Lydia being very happy, because she assumes that means they're going to celebrate, despite the fact that there's nothing saying that they're going to celebrate, to where it really just leads to the rest of it just laughing at Lydia for getting their hopes up for nothing. But it leads to a Mayan family showing up, with them doing a ritual here. A ritual that was kind of boring for the show, and one that Steph clearly did not care about at all. Though, again, it leads into probably one of the funnier moments of this finale, where we see them making a sacrifice. First by putting honey on a fire, with Steph being upset, saying, hello, we want the honey, only for them to then pull out a chicken. Steph being excited that they're going to be able to eat a chicken, only for it to obviously just be a sacrifice instead and be thrown into fire. I was getting a funny moment of Steph saying, did they kill it? With them cutting to the chicken literally burning in the fire. But again, we get Rafe doing his shtick of talking about how much he got out of this ritual, and he's been waiting for a cultural experience like this, and to experience the people, only for Steph to not care and only care about the chicken, because, again, Steph likes food. Where we do see them asking if they can eat it, only for them to be told no, and that will surely be the end of that. But first, we do get to the immunity challenge, it being a giant maze in the shape of a Mayan deity. It's really being propped up as the most complex maze Survivor's ever done, where I do actually think this is a very cool challenge visually. Now, the actual challenge itself was, again, kind of boring. It was obviously just them running around in a maze, and the challenge plays out in a pretty standard way. okay, but definitely a very unique challenge for the time. But ultimately, Rafe ends up pulling out the immunity win once again here, his 4th immunity win after a bit of a drought. But again, kind of insane that Rafe is a player that ends up winning 4 immunities on this season. But obviously this leads to this big dilemma here, with Rafe saying that he now believes he can get to the end and win, with Steph reconfirming that she does intend to go to the end with Rafe, and Rafe saying the same thing back, saying that Rafe is the only person she has a chance against, as they've double-crossed the same people, which, fair, but again, you also don't have a chance against Rafe. But we do see Steph instantly talking about wanting to take Lydia to the final 3, as should be a lot easier to beat in the final 3 immunity challenge, which again is the correct logic here. Again, I think Lydia is someone that, no matter what the final 3 immunity challenge is, it's fairly unlikely someone like Lydia would be able to win it. Again, she hasn't done particularly well in any previous immunity challenge, and definitely based on what we see the challenge end up being, it's definitely one that Lydia could not win. And we do see Rafe here agreeing that is the more strategic decision, but he has a promise with Danny, where obviously at this point, again, he assumed Danny was going to take him to the end, and that obviously gave him more reason to want to keep around Danny over Lydia. Obviously, again, the fault in this logic is the fact that Danny is someone that is obviously more likely to beat Lydia in the final immunity challenge. Obviously, again, they did think that Danny was sick enough to where she would not be able to perform in the final challenge, but still, just body type wise, she's someone more acclimated for a final immunity challenge, and also considering the fact that she is equally likely to beat you at the end, obviously it becomes a much more precarious position. Mind you, I do actually still understand the logic from Rafe, as at the end of the day, Danny is someone that is taking him to the end at this point, while Lydia is not. At this point, Lydia was intending on taking Steph to the end, which with that in mind, I actually do think for Rafe, I can at least understand the logic here, though obviously for Steph, it just makes no sense at all, where you see Lydia campaigning to Steph to keep her here, only for Steph to say that Rafe hasn't given her an answer yet, that she'd rather go to the end with you than Danny, but it's Rafe's decision, which I question, why is it Rafe's decision? Where I at least get it in the Cindy vote, where the Cindy vote's one where, again, it was a 3-2, even if Steph flipped, it would have been difficult to get the 3rd vote. I at least get it there. Here, this just makes no sense, considering you can cause a tie. You actually know what the tiebreaker is nowadays, considering what happened last season at the Final 4. You know it's a fire-making challenge at Final 4. So I don't understand why Steph doesn't push a bit more here to keep Lydia. She definitely could have had Lydia and Danny go and fire, to which it seemed like Lydia was good at the survival aspects of the game. I would not be shocked if Lydia does beat Danny in a fire-making challenge. So again, I do think this is something that definitely felt like a missed opportunity for Steph here. And ultimately, again, she loses anyway. It doesn't really matter in terms of her winning the game, but it definitely increases the odds of her getting to our ideal Final 2 with Rafe, while also guarantees that she makes Final 2, where, even though, again, she ended up being guaranteed for Final 2 anyway, at this current point, it was not intended for that to be the case. Danny was taking Rafe at this point in the game. So ultimately, again, I just think this is a bad decision gameplay-wise for Steph, even though it kind of works out for her in the sense of getting her to the end. Really, who cares about any of this? Because really, all that Steph truly cares about at this point is the chicken. Where they're talking about how the chicken is still there and asking if we can eat it, to where we do proceed to see her, Danny, and Lydia proceed to eat the chicken, with Rafe clearly being annoyed here and passes on eating any of it, talking about how powerful the experience was to see the ritual and learn about sacrifices, and saying that eating the chicken makes that all pointless. Only for Steph to say, we're not going to let the bugs get it, and if the chicken's still there, we're eating it. To which we then proceed to cut to it pouring rain, which is very funny. The fact that they eat this sacrifice, and to which they then proceed to have the worst weather they've had all season, and Steph proceeding to ask for forgiveness, which is again a very funny sequence there, leading into Tribal, where I also find it funny how really annoyed Jeff ends up being over them eating the chicken, like seemingly blaming them for the rain that was happening at Tribal. But we also have him again getting a funny little dig at Steph, saying, I know you ate it, when asking who ate the chicken. But again, this ends up being a pretty bad look for Steph here, her saying that she respected the ritual, but we're starving. Only for us to cut to Gary shaking his head from the jury, where again, clearly the show wanted us to demonize them for eating the chicken, and that's why again, I would have done the same thing. Either way, it's a 3-1 Lydia vote, with the jury clearly being annoyed at Lydia and Danny being the two to get votes here, where again, clearly those were their rooting interests at this point. But ultimately, again, Lydia ends up going home here, and what ends up being a very questionable decision by the end. Again, it's still a spot where Lydia was seemingly a big jury threat. I mean, based on what people have said post-show, it does seem like Lydia very likely beats most people at the end, definitely beats Rafe and Steph at the end, where at the end of the day, again, like it's not like the win equity between Danny and Lydia was that different. They both would have demolished both Rafe and Steph at the end. It really was more so a debate around challenge strength, as again, Lydia was probably the worst challenge performer of the entire season. I think taking her to the Final 3 would have been more of a guarantee. They would have beaten her, but I think it would have been unlikely for Lydia to even get to Final 2 realistically. And really beyond that, it's not like Lydia had that much gumption in the game, or despite the fact that she had a lot of win equity, I don't think Lydia was the greatest player in the world. She was just kind of on the bottom of whatever group she was in for most of the season. Even the tail end here, she's kind of being dragged along just because she wasn't particularly good at challenges. And even that didn't even take her to the very end of the game. To where, again, I don't think Lydia's a particularly good player, though. Again, she was a likable presence on this season. Nothing against her from a personal standpoint. And actually, again, kind of feel bad for her based on what ended up later happening to her with the passing of her son the following year. But in terms of, again, her as a television character, she simply just was not really shown on the show that much, which is a shame considering, again, it seemed like the people on the island did like her and did think of her as someone that could have been one of the biggest characters of the season, yet we just did not get any of that on the show, with it being kind of clear that production did not seem to like her that much. But anyway, we then cut to the final 3, where it's essentially a spot where Danny needs to win final immunity to get to the end, in a spot where she would likely win if that's the case, all while Steph and Rafe end up obviously being loyal to each other. And we don't really get that much content before the immunity challenge, really just content around Steph finding maggots in their corn, which is disgusting, along with the rites of passage, which was kind of boring, though weird that they just, for some reason, had characters on each of the torches, for some reason. But anyway, we get to the final immunity challenge. It being a fairly unique final immunity challenge here, it being one where you have to balance on a swivelly platform, where for the first hour, you'll be able to hold on to 2 ropes, though after an hour, it'll go down to 1 rope, and after 30 minutes after that, you'll have no ropes. Feeling like a challenge that was, again, meant to be more of a balance challenge than a, full-on endurance challenge. Though, once they go down the 1 rope, we see everyone just falling to the side, and this really just becomes a challenge of, pressing your back against the pole while keeping your feet on the platform, and it ends up radically changing this challenge into something that I don't even think the producers intended. It being a challenge that very much benefited those that are taller, aka Danny, in a spot where Lydia would have been completely screwed in a challenge like this. I don't even think she could have been able to hold the position that the others were able to stay in for quite a while. But again, it also felt pretty clear that this is a challenge that they were hoping to not last particularly long, where obviously this is in the aftermath of Baba Booey, obviously breaking the record for longest challenge in the history of the show, and it felt like this was a spot here where I do not think that they wanted this challenge to go nearly as long. Obviously, these set checkpoints where the challenge gets harder really just feels like an excuse to make this challenge shorter, where it seemed like they really wanted this challenge to be done in just a few hours. It does end up being where we do see Rafe ending up getting DQ'd fairly quickly after they get rid of the ropes, with him accidentally touching the pole with his hand, leading to a battle between Danny and Steph, with, again, it being very clear that Steph was not going to win this, with her getting closer and closer to the bottom every time we cut back to her. Although Danny doesn't seem to be struggling at all, just playing around for hair. Ultimately, Danny wins final immunity here, with Steph sobbing after she falls, with Steph obviously feeling like she's about to be voted out here and feeling like she's lost the game. We do see Danny consoling her, only for Rafe to approach her, saying that he wants to release her from any promise that she has towards him and that she can take whoever he wants, which I obviously question, why did he do this? And this is something that really gets propped up as this game-losing decision for Rafe, though realistically, again, he lost the game anyway. Danny was going to beat him in a jury vote either way, but it's still a bad move here, and realistically, again, it's not really a move. It's really a moment here of Rafe just trying to be a good guy, again, obviously being very empathetic, feeling bad for Steph here, and wanting to at least give Steph a chance. Now, despite that, again, it seemed like he was still in a spot where he did not think he was actually going to be voted out. It felt like he still thought Danny was going to take him to the end, and this is all just, again, kind of more so for show than anything, but it's still a spot where it is, again, a suboptimal decision to be making here. Again, you should be really strong-arming Danny into still taking you to the end. But ultimately, again, it's a choice that doesn't really matter as much. It's a spot where either way he would have lost in a jury vote. If anything, actually, this probably actually helps his perception post-show. Where I think Rafe is someone that when people think of Survivor Guatemala, he's looked at as one of the better players. And again, he gets talked about as a player that had some win equity post-show, when in reality, it doesn't seem like he really did against anybody but Steph. And again, this ends up, again, kind of preserving that image at least. Oh, this actually ends up, again, also probably not being great for Steph, where I feel like this leads to Steph obviously getting to the end and being demolished in a jury vote where everyone knows just how massive of a goat she is, where I actually think it probably would have been better for Steph's legacy if she was this fallen angel that didn't quite get to the end, to which they probably would have edited her differently. They probably wouldn't have shown how upset some of her fellow tribe mates were in that position. So ultimately, again, I think this is kind of funny in the fact that it's a move that obviously gives Danny this permission to vote out Rafe. It's about where it did seem like she was actually intending to take Rafe to the end, despite the fact that she thought she would lose to him, which is, again, not actually what was going to happen. But it did feel like she was at least willing to up to this point. Though obviously with him giving her the permission to vote him out at this point, it obviously just further incentivizes her to vote him out in a spot where she clearly knows that is what she should be doing, as it's so obvious that she would beat Steph at the end. So we obviously don't get that much content back at camp, though what we do get is, again, really hyping up Danny for having this underdog story about having the numbers against her. And she talks about how Rafe has released her from her promise and now has pressure on her, as Steph fought so hard and deserves a chance. Because clearly that is the reason why you would take Steph to the end. There again, she talks about being torn between the two, and that's a hard decision. But she came to win, aka she's clearly taking Steph, but says that she's not going to be ready until she has to get up and write a name down. And again, there should be an obvious decision. But we do get the tribal, where I found this tribal very funny in that we do see Jeff once again just trashing Lydia for no reason. Again, asking Steph if she regrets voting out Lydia, with Steph saying, well, we didn't know what the final immunity challenge was going to be, if it was going to be physical or mental, when it's like the final immunity challenge has only been mental once up to this point. And up to this point, final immunity's really been physical all but one time. It's literally only been mental one time in Australian Outback, where again, I would not be worrying about that at this point in Survivor history. But again, it is funny to see Jeff proceed to say, well, 95% of challenges, Lydia's going to be the weak person. Only for like Steph to feel like very defensive here, saying, well, the best I could do was just tie it up, and that wouldn't even guarantee that Lydia stays. Which again, probably not the greatest thing to be talking about how you were willing to vote out Danny in a spot where Danny is the sole person that decides your fate in this game at this point. But again, we get more hyping up of how bad of a decision this was for Rafe to release Danny from her promise, with us seeing the jury being shocked at that. And again, we get more of Danny's dilemma, but again, clearly Rafe was going to get voted out here, with Rafe leaving the game here, rooting for Stephanie, and seemingly being bitter at Danny for voting him out, despite the fact that told her that he's okay for voting him out. Now, truth be told, again, I think he votes for Stephanie anyway. I don't think he's rooting for Stephanie because of bitterness necessarily, but it does feel like he is funnily bitter at her final decision here, despite the fact that, again, like, you literally opened it up for this to happen. I don't think she would have done this if it wasn't for you doing this. But either way, again, we lose Rafe. And Rafe, I do think, is probably the best player of the season. I do think he is the player that had the most control, had the most agency throughout the season. That being said, still played a very flawed game. I do not think Rafe is a great player in the grand scheme of things. I think he's a player that obviously is very emotional, in the sense that I think he cares too much about how people perceive him and allows that to really affect his game. He cares so much about wanting to look like the good guy and not wanting to work with bad people. And again, I do think that definitely harms his position in the game, where I think that's a lot of the reason why he takes Danny as far as he does. Now, again, there was a strategic side to that as well, and the fact that he thought Danny would take him to the end. But even then, he ends up messing that up for himself, to where, again, I definitely have flaws with Rafe's game in that sense, though I still think Rafe is someone that is, again, very affable. Probably a more modern season. I think someone like Rafe would actually probably be more respected from a modern jury. And I do think Rafe is someone that also has a very interesting arc on this season, where I do think his downfall here is actually like kind of interesting in how he kind of gets in his own way. And it kind of feels somewhat reminiscent to Ian from last season. Again, not as good. I do think Ian's arc in season 10 is still probably one of the best tragic arcs in the history of the show. And again, Rafe doesn't really live up to that, though I do think Rafe's story here ends up being an interesting one. And I do think he is a fairly unique character in Survivor history, and one that obviously went on to do more successful things, was a showrunner on Wheel of Time and wrote for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And again, I know he's gone on to do some pretty big things in his career, to where, again, he's not a particularly likely person to ever play Survivor again, both from a time commitment standpoint, but also from the fact that I don't think production loved Rafe, and also they don't love Guatemala either. But I still think, again, him being a very early super fan of the show that actually went on the show and did pretty well, while also having, again, this very complex portrayal here of him struggling with the morality of the game, I think, again, is a recipe for a very interesting returnee here. Yeah, again, it's just never going to happen. But with that, we then get to the final two of Danny versus Steph, where obviously the result of this was fairly obvious at this point. It did not seem like Steph was someone that was particularly likely to win based on how people were talking about her, though at the same time, again, Danny's winning trajectory here is very strange from an editing perspective. Obviously, again, Danny was someone that was very under-edited throughout a lot of the season, really does pop towards the end here, and I do think in these last 3 episodes, there is a lot of good content here that would make you think that she is a viable winner, but it is still a position where her edit as a whole is very strange, and to be fair, that's mostly in line with the editing of the season as a whole, where I do think the editing of the season was just very inconsistent. It just really feels like a season where they didn't really bother to set up long-term storylines, and Danny really doesn't become a major character until the tail end of her game, but that's kind of reminiscent to just how her game played out on this season. Though again, while the Danny win did come off as a bit of a surprise at the time, I do think, especially by the time we get to this final two, it should have been abundantly clear that Danny was going to win this. But again, we get some content back at camp before they go to Final Tribal, where they end up burning everything, with Danny again getting good underdog content here, talking about, you may be down, but you're never out. While Steph talks about having overcome every odd and is proud that she's able to get to the final two. And then after this, nothing will stand in her way, except for a very bitter jury. And again, that's really just for this season. And again, really for all the other seasons of reality TV she's going to be on after this. Again, she surely will have nothing standing in in her way because Stephanie is a well-known winner of things, but does seem to be coming into Final Tribal here pretty hot, talking about how she outplayed and outlasted all of them, and that's why they're on the jury, and she's not, where it felt like she was going to come off very combative at Final Tribal, though we don't really get that. Where Final Tribal itself ends up being a fairly tame affair. While there's a couple notable moments from it, it's not really one of the better ones in the history of the show, though, again, Danny ends up really propping up her underdog story about how she thought there was no way that she'd be sitting here, and talks about people underestimate her, and that she has an athletic background, which I never would have guessed that. All Steph says that she knows that people are upset at her, and she'll be as honest as she can. Getting into our first question here from Bobby John, a pretty tame question of just him asking them if they're proud of themselves, and obviously they say they are, where, again, a massive softball question. And finally, obviously, Bobby John being a massive locked vote here for Danny, despite the fact that he openly says, I know the only reason I'm here is because of Steph, yet despite that, was seemingly very anti-Steph on the jury, and obviously just had a much better relationship with Danny throughout the season. But then we cut to Gary, who talks about judging his vote on who gives the most honest answer, and that the game is going to be played until the last answer you give tonight, because surely Steph definitely has a chance to win here. But again, he ends up asking them, why should I not vote for you? With Steph saying, because I voted you out. And then Danny says the same thing. What a lame answer. But then we get to Jamie, who, again, clearly was a Danny vote here, very bitter against Steph. Again, asking a softball question to Danny about who her top 5 would have been, with her proceeding to just say her old Yaksha members, which is only 4 people. Also, again, kind of a waste saying Brandon here, considering Brandon's not on the jury, but whatever. Again, he then proceeds to ask Steph a more hard-hitting question here of how do you think the jury feels about you being best friends with people and then voting them out, with Steph proceeding to say that his vote off was not her sole decision and that she had a hard time telling people that she was voting them out. And you even said, blindsided, it's the best way to go. It's like, that's not what he said. Anyway, we then cut to Lydia, with this also actually being kind of humorous as well, with her telling Steph that she's been loyal to her since day 6. And why should I vote for you? With Steph proceeding to say, thank you for being so loyal. And says that I would have had a better shot if I took you to the final. But what does that say about me? I'm taking Lydia because I can beat her? That's not what competitive people do. I want to beat the best, and that's why Danny's sitting next to me right now. Which is an insane response. I mean, this is literally you saying, hey, Lydia, I didn't take you because you suck so bad. While also talking about how, Danny's the best, that's why I'm sitting next to her. While also just being a lie anyway. You do not want to sit next to Danny. Like, I generally don't understand this response. It's such a weird thing to say. But then we cut to Cindy, who has a pretty boring question, just asking if they could remove a jury member, who would it be? With Danny appropriately saying Rafe, saying that she knows that he's voting for Stephanie. All Steph says, I don't know. And then proceeds to say, I guess Bobby John, because he was the first to make it. And it's like, that's kind of a dumb answer, considering Bobby John's literally a person that's on the jury because of you. Now again, truth be told, I don't know if she necessarily had a good answer here, but still, again, just kind of funny, her being the reason Bobby John's here, just be very openly throwing away his jury vote. But anyway, we then got to Rafe, who I thought also had a pretty humorous question here, asking Danny, saying that you said you'd take who deserves to win to the end, so what happened when you made the opposite decision last night? Which again, implying that Steph is the less deserving person, despite the fact that he is upping up Steph as someone that should win this jury vote. And Danny, again, just kind of giving a BS answer to this, saying you're both deserving. All he ends up asking Steph, what was her best move that she made that you didn't tell me about? With Steph proceeding to say she can't think of one. Which is obviously not what Rafe was looking for. But I do love Rafe proceeding to tell her that you need to say how you think you should win in your closing comments, which felt, again, like him kind of trying to coach her in what was in kind of a losing battle anyway. But again, it really felt like Rafe here was just trying to give Steph a softball here, only for her to not really take that opportunity. But either way, we get to the final jury question here from Judd, with him having a pretty fun speech here. Not necessarily one that comes off as, again, one of the most iconic in the history of the show, but still what you would expect from Judd. Him asking Danny if she has ice skated or rollerbladed before, with Danny just being confused, having said she's done both, but not very well, only for Judd to say, well, you're one of the best he's ever seen, as you skated right through this game, man. To which he then proceeds to ask her if she's been the seat 4 backstabber, with Danny admitting to the fact that she did lie to Jamie, with Judd then saying that sounds like you lied a lot, and I suggest you go to confession. Which, like, is that a lot? I feel like she mentioned one time. Now again, did Danny lie more than that? Maybe, probably. I assume so. But again, just a very weird comment here from Judge. It felt like he always had this line in his head no matter what her response was. But then obviously we get the more spicy part of this, with him then going to Steph saying, "Are you still starving?" Saying that you've eaten more than me at home, and the only thing you should be starving for is my damn vote, man. Says that her strategy was to backstab and be deceitful, with Steph saying not true, saying you backstab everyone in this game, and that you crossed the line when you lied to my wife, and that's pretty brutal. It says that I'm gonna promise you something, gonna stick to my promise, with him proceeding to never actually say what that promise is because Steph interrupts him. Or I do wonder if he had more to his speech here that, again, Steph just cut off. But again, this leads to this, again, debate here of, oh, was it a lie? Did Steph lie to Kristen? As again, she wasn't lying at that point. She had no idea she was gonna vote out Judd, which, again, is true. I mean, like, again, by the definition of lying, Stephanie was not lying to Kristen. She did think she was gonna take Judd further into the game at that point. And even then, from what we've seen at least, it didn't even seem like she even promised Kristen she was going to take Judd to the final two. But even then, not a great look for Steph here to be fighting with a jury member over the definition of lying, where, again, I think it's better you just take your losses here. But ultimately, again, it doesn't really matter. It's not like she was getting Judd's jury vote anyway. But I do find it funny this all leads up to Steph proceeding to give Danny credit for tricking her into voting out Judd, only for Danny to be shaking her head, not wanting that credit, which again just feels very opposed to modern Survivor here. But anyway, we do get to the final speeches, which are pretty tame here. Steph again talking about letting other people make the decisions, despite previously alluding to be the one making all the decisions, all while Danny says that it was Steph and Rafe controlling the game and that they're the reason you're up there, which again does not seem great from a modern perspective, though was seemingly effective with this jury. And we do see Jeff proceeding to really prop up this jury, saying you can't ask more from a jury. And again, this is kind of just like, fine, final try. I don't know why Jeff seemed to be really propping it up here, but either way, we get to the vote where it's pretty predictable where this result's going to land, with us seeing Judd saying that he's going to keep his promise of never voting for Steph, where he ends up voting for Danny here. Rafe ends up voting for Steph because of her character and how she turned weaknesses into strengths. I guess. I don't know what that really means. But anyway, we have Jeff being flown to the reunion on a helicopter, with this being a very tame transition in comparison to previous seasons, though at least there's a transition at all. But again, we get to the jury vote, with the reveal also that the winner of the season will also get one of the cars that Cindy didn't give away. They had to give out those cars some way, but ultimately ends up being a 6-1 Danny vote here, which was fairly predictable. Again, a blowout in a spot where, again, just Steph was never going to get any jury votes here from anyone other than Rafe. To which we also get a very awkward winner reaction here, with Danny clearly being confused on what she should be doing, not knowing if she should be going down to her family or not until eventually told to do so. But either way, again, a fine conclusion to this season. I think Danny's win here is actually one that I do think is fairly unique, both in terms of the edit and also in terms of her storyline. Now, again, it would have been more unique if we didn't see Chris Doherty do a similar thing just a couple seasons ago. But still, it's definitely a type of win that you don't see as often. This person who came to emerge down in numbers, and unlike Chris, where Chris eventually recovers and ends up being in a power position towards those last few rounds, Danny is someone that really is on the bottom for the entire time and really ends up skating through making this good connection with Rafe. That is a very interesting winning trajectory here. Now, again, edit-wise, she didn't really get as much content as many of the other people on this season, and again, to be fair, part of that might be due to her own doing. But obviously, just in general, again, players like Danny are people that don't typically get the largest edits in the world, which she perfectly fits into this like under the radar female winner edit that was very typical in older school Survivor, to where, while obviously coming into the season, Steph was a massive fan favorite, and I do think it would have been assumed that if Steph gets to the end, Steph would definitely win. I do think by the end of the season, it becomes pretty apparent how Danny won, and more particularly how Steph lost, where I do feel like a lot of this season is more so telling the story of how Steph lost over how Danny won, with that story not really starting at the tail end of it. Either way, before talking about the final two, I do also want to mention the reunion here, where, straight up, this is not a particularly notable reunion in the grand scheme of things. It's a mostly tame affair, though we do get some notable moments, particularly from the beginning of it, where I did find it very funny that Danny's winner montage here is literally just her buying the advantage in the auction. Because I guess that's the only thing that they'll give her credit for that led to her win. But we do also get some weird content from them asking her about what her best move was, and her answering voting out Rafe. It's like, no, like your best move was making the relationship with Rafe. But this leads to her notably calling herself a stealth bomber, saying that she never flew under the radar, she just beat the radar, which again is a good quote there. Something I think a lot of people really utilize to prop up her game, and I think it leads to some people probably overrating Danny, especially before Winners at War, that she was actually like a truly great player, but we just didn't get to see it. When in reality, I think she's, again, fine. Like, she's okay. Definitely not like a contender to be one of the best players of all time or anything, but again, definitely had a pretty good social game while out there, but definitely not this like strategic mastermind I think some people maybe thought she could have been. But I do love how we see Jeff agreeing with this statement, saying, yeah, I didn't see you playing the game until very late. But outside that, again, not a particularly notable reunion, though we do get a couple funny moments from Jeff in particular, with Jeff asking Lydia, how were you still in the game? Where he said, I asked you that at every tribal. And while he does proceed to prop her up for having a good attitude. And again, I did feel like that was just a very awkward interaction there. Also, we see him very blatantly trying to get people to admit that they were starstruck by Steph, only for a couple people to deny that, only for Jeff that didn't really push into Gary, trying to get him to say that. Oh, we also see him proceeding to call out Steph's challenge record, that she's played in 46 challenges and has lost 36 of them, which again felt unnecessary outside of just bashing on Steph. Also, while we also have him out of the blue just calling out Judd for lying in the game. Beyond that, we also get a very awkward moment from the Bobby John Jamie rivalry segment, with Jamie saying, I almost didn't come as I heard there was going to be a vote, and like asked Rafe to not vote him out, where again, clearly this is like him trying to play into his shtick, though I just felt like it came off very awkward here. Oh, we also get a weird moment of Jeff asking Blake about his girlfriend's reaction to his comments, and Blake talking about how her dad told him that, I can't believe my daughter's breast got you voted out of Survivor, which is like a weird thing to say. Oh, we see Jeff also seemingly being annoyed at Brian, where, again, Brian's obviously in this, like, know-it-all archetype that Jeff never seemed to love from the offset, to where while there's many of them that he's grown to love, I do feel like he clearly came off annoyed at Brian here, even though he proceeds to say at the end that, I'm not picking on you, and you were a delight to have on the show, only for him to probably proceed to forget Brian Corden even existed. But again, we still get Jeff, like, finally just chucking in on all the players, which he eventually stops doing as the years go by. But again, funny that we bother checking in on some of the most forgettable figures in the history of Survivor, where I do love that Jeff ends this by saying, you gave us a great season in a tough situation, where I do also wonder how much they do blame the conditions for how the season played out, where again, we know that Jeff did not like this season, and part of that due to how much the cast did not play out as they expected, but I do feel like obviously a lot of that was probably due to the conditions, and I feel like that's probably something they kind of underestimated on this season. But anyway, we end the season, but obviously we end this all with a preview of Survivor Panama, with the return of Exile Island, and also the reveal that the 16 castaways are going to be divided in a way you've never seen, probably because we should have never seen it, but again, we'll get to that next time. But again, before we end this video, I do want to talk about the final two of the season, starting it off with Steph. And Steph obviously has a very interesting returning storyline on this season, obviously coming into this being one of the most popular players in the history of the show, and comes back to get a much more villainous edit, definitely an edit that was not as flattering, definitely an edit where we saw her be very cocky, we saw her be very selfish, we saw her be on a massive high horse, and again, it definitely was not the best look here for Steph, in a spot where, again, it felt like Steph was one of the new faces of the show, definitely this person that inspired a lot of people to want to be on the show. Still to this day, again, one of the strongest women from a physical standpoint the show has had, and also someone that, at the time of this recording, obviously is about to be on Survivor 50, pretty much solely based on how popular she was back at the time of season 10. To where, again, Stephanie was so popular coming into the season, which makes her run on the season so interesting in the fact that it's one that I think production tries to forget. It's one where when you hear people talk about Stephanie, you almost solely hear people just talk about her Palau appearance and not really about her Guatemala appearance, where even coming into Here's the Villain, there was a lot of references to Palau, but almost no references to Guatemala, and it very much feels like her Guatemala run is one that they kind of want to forget, as obviously it taints her legacy. Now, not necessarily as a player, where, again, I don't think Stephanie was ever propped up to be the greatest player in the world, but definitely as, again, this likable hero figure where, again, I think if you were to literally just watch Survivor Guatemala, I think you would question, should she be on the Heroes tribe on the Heroes vs. Villain season? Now, at the end of the day, she was still the most popular player on this season, despite the fact that she came off less likable. Again, she still was a pretty big name at this point. She still was a big name by the time she came back for Heroes vs. Villains, though it does feel like her Guatemala run here is one that does seem to be one that production would like to forget, with her not coming off the most flattering, and also, again, it feeling like gameplay-wise, it's the complete opposite of what she had in Palau. She was in a power position for a lot of the season, also made some very questionable decisions along the way, definitely not the most strategically sound player on the board, while also having no win equity at the end. And obviously, again, I won't fault her for all of that, as again, I do think a lot of that had to do with this anti-returnee sentiment, though at the same time, she definitely did not handle the jury particularly well, to where ultimately, again, it's definitely not a great look here for Stephanie from a gameplay perspective, or from a perception standpoint, though considering how unpopular the season ended up being, she kind of gets fortunate in the fact that just people don't remember the season, which kind of helps her legacy in the grand scheme of things, even though, again, if people did remember the season, it probably would sink it a little bit. But with that, let's talk about the winner in Danny. And Danny, again, as I mentioned before, I just think is a strange winner in retrospect now, especially post Winners at War, where obviously we saw a return from Winners at War. It not go particularly great for her there. And obviously, again, she was fighting against the fact that a lot of people just didn't know who she was, the fact that she just had no relationships out there, where she was definitely coming into it in a pretty bad position. But Danny is a player that I think as time goes on is sadly going to be kind of forgotten about, because I actually, up to Winners at War, I feel like Danny was always talked about as one of the most underrated winners, a winner that was actually a great player that we just didn't really get to see. But it really, in the time since Winners at War, where again she kind of flopped on that season, it feels like a lot of that talk is kind of dissipated, where I feel like people don't talk about Danny as favorably anymore, or really much at all anymore. Where again, when you talk about the most underrated winners, Danny's not usually in that conversation anymore, because I think a lot of people look at Winners at War and be like, oh yeah, I guess she never was that good. Though I will say, again, as much as, again, I don't think Danny is the greatest player in the grand scheme of things, she is definitely very skilled for aspects of the game. Again, she is still a very likable social presence, where no one on this season really has a bad word to say about her. She, again, was in a spot where she came into merge down in numbers. And while, again, I do think her surviving those first few rounds was more so based around just other people being bigger threats, I do think she plays from the final 6 on fairly well. Where the fact that she ends up surviving the final 4 round is still pretty insane. And I do think that is something to credit to Danny, along with the fact that also, like, Danny would have been in a pretty good position early game. Coming into the merge, had her tribe come in with the numbers, where it seemed like she was the best position from her original tribe, to where I think Danny's someone that probably is a bit under-respected for her actual game on Guatemala, even though I do think probably the general consensus on her as a player is probably more accurate nowadays than what it was, where again, I don't think Danny is the greatest player in the world, but definitely someone that does have skills for the game, and someone that, again, we didn't really get to see a lot of that on her actual season. But again, I do think her reappearance on Winners of War kind of skewed perception in the opposite direction, probably a bit too negative, to where ultimately I think she's kind of in the middle of those two, just being, again, a kind of okay player, okay winner, again, to where while she was on the bottom for a lot of the game, I don't think a lot of that was necessarily her fault, and I think she played pretty well from the bottom, to where I ultimately fault her as much as some other players that were on the bottom for a lot more of the game, especially considering I do feel like she played fairly optimally from that bottom position. But again, with that is the end of Survivor Guatemala. Again, a season that I still do like. I have a level of nostalgia for this season, not really because it's a season that I've actually watched quite a bit. It's more so a season that, again, obviously is very underappreciated. It's a season that many people don't really talk about, and I think that kind of added this appeal to the season for me back when I started watching Survivor, and I do think I probably overrated it for a bit. I used to have it as a season that's nearing my top 15 of seasons. I think at this point, again, it's probably middle of the road, again, in the spot where we're nearing Survivor 50, probably, again, rank it closer to the 24-25 sort of spot. But I still do like this season. While there's definitely things to criticize, particularly in terms of its casting, I do think it has some very notable characters. And again, it's really just a season that is a very character-focused season. It's a season that doesn't really have the most riveting gameplay throughout it, but it is a season that has, again, some insane characters like Judd, like Jamie, Steph was an interesting character on this season. Rafe had an interesting downfall. Bobby John, and Gary Hawkins. You have some great pre-mergers like Brian and Amy, to where, again, I do ultimately think this is a cast that does have some gems in it, though I do kind of understand why it's understated. Obviously, it's a season that is kind of in this middle era of the show, where the show wasn't as popular anymore, while also, again, it not really living up to the best of the best seasons, to where I do fully get why this is a season that is kind of forgotten about in the grand scheme of things. There are things to appreciate from the season, though it definitely is one of the least important seasons to the show's history. But again, with that, those are my thoughts on Survivor Guatemala. Now, again, like my other retrospectives, I will be following this up with a player ranking for Survivor Guatemala eventually, sometime down the road. Also, obviously, I'll be back next spring for Survivor Panama, for my Survivor Panama retrospective. We'll see how that goes. But again, stay tuned for that, along with also, obviously, just the other typical content from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.